You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ninja One understands that IT teams today are stretched thin, trying to manage too many disconnected tools. So they built a platform that brings them all together. Ninja One unifies endpoint management, autonomous patching, backup, and remote access into a single intelligent platform. That means fewer tools, lower costs, higher efficiency, and a team that has the bandwidth and confidence to stay ahead. Unify IT to simplify work with Ninja One. Learn more at ninjaone.com.
Hi, I'm Cassidy.
And I'm April, and together we are fashion historians, friends, and co-hosts of Dress, the History of Fashion, a podcast about why the clothes we wear matter throughout history and around the world.
From the cultural and societal to the personal and often political, with each episode we explore the multitude of meanings quite literally sewn into the clothes we wear.
Please join us in unraveling the hidden histories residing in your closet. New episodes are available on Wednesdays, and our Dressed Classic episodes re-air each Friday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your favorite shows.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much. You're the reason this podcast is still going.
If everyone who listened to this podcast gave just $1 a month, we could both turn this podcast into a full-time job and be certain that we could keep it going throughout the pandemic and keep bringing you more episodes. It would be a win for everyone.
If you're not a member and you're able to donate, go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. Members get ad-free episodes, extra episodes about fascinating topics, and hilarious, mostly drunken conversations we've had with other podcasters and guests.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl and sign up today to join the fun. This is Rome. Women don't get to inherit things.
Your husband is a good man, and while there might be more white in his mustache than black, he is still your tribe's bravest warrior. He is 10 years your senior, but he values your words. Your husband cares for you. He is a kind man, the kind of man you can build a life with. So it sticks in your throat that you cannot agree with him on this big thing that he is asking of you, of all the Iceni, his people. You sat with him as the Romans offered their terms for peace. Throw down all your swords, they said, and they will let your tribe alone. They will allow you to live under your own customs, and they will raise your husband to kingship. The Romans spoke as if your husband ruled at their pleasure, as if he gained all his authority from them, and not from the will of the Iceni. They are commanding your people to disarm, to throw away their weapons, their ancestral swords and spears and shields. You know why. Neighboring tribes have been fractious. Rebellions have broken out like rashes all over the land. Wales is still on fire. The Romans do not trust even their staunchest allies now. Not even your tribe, who allied itself with them at the beginning. The other tribes hated your people for the choice they made, but the Romans were too strong. It seemed the only way at the time. But now you are questioning everything. You sat quietly by your husband's side, clenching and unclenching your fists as the Romans made their demands. And your husband listened politely, inclined his head, and didn't take out his sword and smash in the lying skulls of the invaders. When the Romans are gone, he asks for the room to be cleared, so you two may speak in private. You start in immediately. Has he forgotten the siege at Stonia camp? You demand. The men, women, and children who were butchered by the Romans. You will never forget the sight of that small boy's head cleaved in by a Roman sword. You watch as his face falls in upon itself, like a cliff sliding into the heaving sea. When he looks at you with his dark, kind eyes, all you feel is his weakness. And you do not know how you can bear to stand by his side, raise his children, and rule with him for another moment. Wife, he says, we must do this thing. And I know that you would counsel me against it, but there is no other way. I will not see our people in chains. I will not watch as these terrible men lay their hands upon my wife and children and haul them away before me as I stand helpless. I see no other way. I will not watch as our people are destroyed. What are warriors without swords, you demand? What are we without the ability to defend ourselves? We are their captives. We are their subjects, he answers, and we get to rule ourselves. We get to keep our lands. He reaches out to uncurl your clenched hands. What good are lands when we don't have the means to protect them, you ask? What happens when these Romans change their mind and want our land or our people for themselves? Your husband takes your hands in his. My wife, they have asked us to throw away our swords, and we shall. But we are metal workers and warriors. When the Romans turn their eyes west or south or north, when they believe they have subdued us, we will forge new weapons, stronger weapons, because the god Camulus will not let this slight to us go unanswered. He is slow to anger, but he sees all. You smile, your spirits lifting. Perhaps he has not been so quick to sell your people's dignity after all. The king keeps his sword, you say. Tell the Romans that it is a matter of ceremony. The pompous Romans will understand that. Then we will give them their show of disarming, but we will tell our people that the swords they are giving up aren't for the Romans. They are a sacrifice for Camulus, for Andraste, for Epona, who have seen these injustices and will guide our hands to victory when the time comes. Yes, your husband says. His hands hold yours, warm and strong, and now you are as one when the time comes. I'm Jen McMenemy.
And I'm Jenny Williamson, and this is Ancient History Fangirl.
Jenny, we're here! We're finally here!
I cannot believe we've actually made it to this episode. We've been talking about it for years.
3 years.
Yes! It was like one of the earliest episodes we wanted to do.
I have literally been waiting to tell this story since we launched the podcast. And as I'm sure everyone listening has figured out by now, I really love a good revolution. I love digging into the story of people who either peaceably worked for change or took up arms to overthrow their oppressors. Ancient history is rife with these stories of revolution, and the story of Boudicca's revolt is just about as epic as you can get. There's Romans behaving badly, because it's Romans. They're almost always behaving badly. We're going to talk about sexual assault and rape in this episode, so this is your warning towards the end of the episode. There's also murder and flames. And there's a layer of destruction that was literally scorched into the archaeological record of London and Colchester. That layer is called the Boudicca layer.
I love that so much.
Me too. So I didn't know a lot about Boudicca until I visited the UK for the first time as an exchange student. My then boyfriend and now husband, geez, such a long time ago, we were babies. He was the first one to introduce me to this story of Boudicca. And I think he saw some strange kinship between broke student Jen with her wild, curly, untamed ginger hair, my gross paint-splattered jeans, my purple Doc Martens, and my army surplus bag that was literally covered in a million patches, and an ancient Iron Age warrior queen. But let's be honest, I have no idea what the comparison is there because I just look like a broke-ass student.
It must have been the hair.
Yeah, I did not look like any kind of Celtic or Iceni royalty, but I guess that's what love does to you.
Love goggles, possibly beer goggles.
Absolutely. But it was this moment all those years ago that my boyfriend with his love beer goggles sat me down in a pub, and over a few pints he began to spin the tale of Boudicca. And that, Jenny, is the moment when my obsession started.
Who was this Iron Age warrior queen who stood up to the Romans, whose name was so revered and feared that stories of her were still spun almost 2,000 years later? We had to know more. We were hooked. I mean, mainly Jen was hooked, but I was hooked too. I love this story.
This is one of those stories that we fought to tell. Jenny and I, at the beginning of every season, sit down and carve out the season. And there are always stories that both of us kind of want to tell. And because we're friends and because you got to divide the work evenly, you know, we can't always tell the stories we want to. But this was the Boudicca burn layer hill I was gonna die on.
I mean, I wanted to tell the story of Anglesey and the Druid's Last Stand, and Jen really wanted to do Boudicca. And I think the cool thing about it is that these two stories actually happen around the same time. So we kind of made Boudicca the capstone because we've been laying the burn layer, I suppose you could say, for the entire season. And now we finally, I mean, we've talked about Anglesey, we've talked about the Druids' last stand. We've talked about how the Romans conquered England, what the situation was like. There's a lot about the history that we've just laid down, as a foundation for this. We've talked about Celtic women in mythology. We've talked about ancient female Druids and the Morrigan and the possible roots of genocide of female power holders in Celtic culture that may be echoing down the years in those myths, which I think is really interesting. And now we're finally getting to one of those extremely powerful women that we get to talk about, and I'm really excited about that. Like, she kind of combines everything that we've done elsewhere in this arc. So I think it's really important that we're telling her story and that we're telling it here.
I think without knowing what was going on in Anglesey and how dire everything is at this particular moment in the, occupation of Rome and Britain, you don't understand exactly what this revolution meant in the same way.
So when we discussed spending a season in Rome and Britain, we knew exactly what story Jen wanted to cover. As we said, Boudicca, the legendary queen of the Iceni. But the story of Boudicca and her people is the story of a world on a precipice of great change, because Boudicca's is the story of one of the biggest revolts and possibly the final revolt in southern England against Roman rule. But let's start with the most intriguing question of all. Who was Boudicca?
Well, this is not an easy question to answer because we don't actually know a lot about Boudicca. Even her name is open to debate, and all the archaeological evidence that we find about Boudicca just leaves us with more questions. More things we desperately want to know about the warrior queen who almost convinced Nero to abandon the Roman provinces in Britain, according to the ancient Roman sources. So let's start with what we do know. It's very likely that there was a real Boudicca, but like Spartacus or Vercingetorix or Caratacus or Alaric of the Visigoths, Boudicca probably wasn't her real name. Boudicca essentially comes from a Celtic word for victory. Her name means victory or Victoria or Victoriana in Latin. And while it's possible this was her actual name, it's more likely this was an honorific given to Boudicca by her people and then passed along to the Romans who chronicled her story.
Boudicca was probably born around 30 AD, although we don't know this for sure. All we know for sure is that she died in 61 AD at the Battle of Watling Street, and that would have made her 31 when she died, if we're going with that birth date. She would have likely been a teenager when Claudius's Roman military campaign began in 43 AD, and a young teenager. She would have been like 13. She would have seen the foreigners come to her land after hearing the stories of Julius Caesar's ill-fated campaign about 100 years before. She would have looked at these foreigners and their weapons of war, and maybe she would have felt a sense of unease. What if this time the Romans decided to stay rather than, as Julius Caesar did, packing up and leaving? What if this time they couldn't be bought off with a tribute? What would that mean for her people? In her late teens, Boudicca may have seen what happened to the tribes who rebelled against Rome. She would have watched as Caratacus united the tribes when the Romans attacked his ancestral seat in Camulodunum, which is near modern-day Colchester, and waged a war that ravaged across southeastern England, a war that Caratacus's followers wound up losing, their lands taken, their families sold into slavery. The people who rose up against Rome wound up the worse for wear, and that is an understatement.
Boudicca's tribe, the Iceni, didn't fight with Caratacus. Instead, they were one of 11 who allied with Rome and paid tribute to Claudius's generals.
That was a thing that they did 100 years ago, too, when Julius Caesar came to Britain.
Yeah, they were one of the original 6.
Yeah, and that time, Julius Caesar took their tribute and was like, yep, I rule now, and then he left, and no one ever saw him again. So I could imagine that they were thinking maybe we can just pay them off again. Like, it's not a bad strategy. Like, we'll just say we don't have to start a war, we'll just give them some money and hostages, and they'll go away and never come back. Sucks for the hostages, but just give them people we don't like.
We're only 3 pages in, and it's gone real dark.
Right. I'm sorry, whose podcast do you think this is? Are you new here?
So, a teenager at the time, when Caratacus rebelled, Boudicca couldn't have known that the peace they bought with their allegiance to Rome would be as fragile as a dragonfly's wing. But this peace was preferable to the violence that the tribes who sided with Caratacus faced. It was a peace that let the Iceni live a life, keep their customs, and trade with the Romans. And, for the most part, continue on the way they always had. We don't know much about Boudicca's early life. It's possible she had druidic training or was a priestess of Andraste, the Iceni goddess of victory. All of this is based on tales we have from Tacitus, writing about 15 to 30 years in the future, or Cassius Dio. He's a source who loves to explode the salacious details, and he was writing about 100 years in the future. And we're going to tell you these details in the next episode, so don't be like, where are these details? They're coming.
Things that made the ancient Romans think that maybe Boudicca had druidic training, is what you're saying.
Yeah, or why she might have been a priestess to Andraste. We will actually see that in the next episode because that's where we're going to pull those quotes from or those examples from. But you have to remember these are both Roman sources and they both had axes to grind, both against a female ruler and against the ruling class of Rome. But, as always, they're what we have to go by.
Neither Tacitus nor Dio mentions the words druidic training or priestess. Instead, they imply Boudicca's knowledge by her actions. Actions which could have been misinterpreted by the Roman chroniclers or deliberately manipulated to make Boudicca seem like something she wasn't, to horrify a Roman audience who would have picked up what they were putting down. Druids were scary. Druids were especially scary during this time period. Druids were these strange people who practiced human sacrifices, according to the ancient Romans, and who had spent the last few years making a lot of trouble on the British front and on the Gallic front before then. All of this would have been known to the average Roman. They would have been hearing these scary tales about Druids for over 100 years. It's in the commentaries. Julius Caesar was writing lurid paragraphs about the Wicker Man and Druidic sacrifice in the commentaries that he was sending back from Gaul to be read in public squares all over Rome. So people had this image of the Druids as very scary people. These Roman chroniclers knew that giving Boudicca even the slightest hint of otherworldly power, it was basically othering her. It would present her as, to a Roman reader, as not the average woman who sat at your side and bore your children and ran your household. It presented her as an aberration, a wolf in a woman's dress. And this distinction is important because to imply that Boudicca, a mere woman, could lead an uprising that would nearly cost the Romans the British province would be to accept that women were truly men's equal and maybe even people who could, if the situation was right, snap and spark a revolution that would end in fire and blood. Dudes didn't want to hear that women had this capability because it's like, well, I have a woman in my house. What's she gonna do to me?
Exactly. They didn't want to think that, oh my goodness, all women could be pushed to the point where they could be revolutionaries. They could just overthrow the yoke of this oppression that's been on them. No. She has to be something else. She can't be a woman. It just can't be that.
Those dudes probably were doing things that their wives would want to burn their house down over and like lay down a Boudicca burn layer.
There's a lot of fragile dick energy here. And yes, we salute queens. They have coined that term.
I think we owe them some money now.
We just owe them a pint the next time we see them.
We'll buy them a drink next time we're in the same town. I would love to do that.
So let's continue in the othering of Boudicca.
We were busy othering Boudicca. Let's continue.
Yeah, let's continue. It's fine. What did Boudicca look like? Even this is open to debate. According to Cassius Dio, quote, in stature, she was very tall. In appearance, most terrifying. In the glance of her eye, most fierce. And her voice was harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips. Around her neck was a large golden necklace, and she wore a tunic of diverse colors, over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This was her invariable attire. So let's break this down. Cassius Dio tells us that Boudicca was a giant of a woman.
Just massive.
So massive, so tall. She was Brienne of Tarth, okay?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
She was terrifying with her waist-length, flaming red hair, and she wore a tunic of diverse colors. She would have been wearing a tribal tunic, most likely of like a plaid or like a tartan pattern, because we know that that is something that we see in ancient Gallic and Celtic cultures.
The Gauls are described as wearing what we would recognize as plaid in Roman times, which is really interesting. So that's kind of what I pick up of that.
That's what I'm picking up as well. And, Jenny, I can't leave out the most important detail. The bling. The large gold necklace she wore. Most likely, this necklace was a torque.
Yeah, a torque was a symbol of power in Celtic culture.
It was, and these neck torques were very rarely worn by women. They were largely ceremonial, as they were pretty heavy to wear, and they were almost always worn by men, distinguished warriors. Sometimes warriors went into battle only wearing their torques, or nobility, or kings. Wearing a torque would make Boudicca stand out as a female leader who was so fierce that she wore a necklace traditionally worn by men, by warriors or kings. She was formidable in every sense of the word, including her fashion sense.
Yeah, and so like a torque it's not really like a necklace the way I picture a necklace. I mean, I guess it's a kind of necklace, but like it's more like a round tube, like a really thick neck ring, sometimes very elaborately decorated, with a gap in one side so that you can fit it around your neck, or sometimes they make them for like your arm or your wrist too. And I imagine that this torque was a symbol of her rulership. She might have taken it off her husband's corpse. That's my thought.
Totally. That's what I'm picking up from what the Romans are laying down. She is wearing the king's torque. She is the ruler. They're looking at her wearing a warrior's torque going like, what am I seeing here?
Very hardcore.
Love it.
Archaeology doesn't tell us that the Iron Age Britons were particularly tall. And there is no evidence that the ancient language spoken by the Iceni would have been harsh to the ear, although I don't know, like, in terms of, what ancient Brittonic sounds like. What did it sound like? I don't know.
I did not feel the need to go down a rabbit hole to research this.
So, why does this description matter so much? This description of this towering woman with this harsh voice and this flaming red hair and this massive torque. They're othering her. It serves to make her into this, giant, massive boogie woman who had a harsh voice, who wore the necklace of a warrior king, so she was, stepping outside of her appropriate gender role, according to the Romans, whose hair was long and wild. In short, she was a terrifying figure.
Yeah, that was hair that was not styled like a noble Roman woman's would be.
Right. It was wild and streaming down her back as she rode her chariot into war.
Woohoo!
In short, she was a terrifying barbarian, not a woman. Certainly not a woman like a proper Roman wife or mother. I mean, that's the comparison. And she's not, the only woman from outside of the Roman culture that gets very othered in Roman writing. Another one is Cleopatra. But they're really treated differently. Boudicca isn't described as beautiful and cultured. Well, I mean, Cleopatra wasn't really described by contemporary sources as beautiful either.
Well, she was described as alluring, there was something charismatic,
Yeah, I would say like educated and cultured, like Cleopatra, who was another feared and revered queen who took up arms against Rome. In fact, Boudicca she's like the anti-Cleopatra. She's the complete polar opposite.
Yes.
She's rough and tumble. She can beat you in an arm wrestling match. She might be a queen, but she's not a queen like Cleopatra. She is a warrior queen.
And here's another fascinating link between Boudicca and Cleopatra. They both, according to some contemporary sources and artwork, had red hair.
And that's really interesting. Sometimes Cleopatra was depicted in ancient artwork as having red hair.
Yes, which, I mean, I don't believe she had red hair, but, I want to talk about this for a minute because the red hair is kind of an interesting othering thing that we've seen several times in the ancient sources. We know that Boudicca is usually depicted as being a redhead, wild ginger like me, but we don't actually know that her hair was red. It could just as easily have been brown or strawberry blonde or black, because here's the thing about redheads in antiquity. Particularly in ancient Rome, describing people as having red hair was a way to other them, to set them apart and make them the enemy. We saw this with the Thracians, and it's possible we're seeing it here too.
We also saw it in vampire myths.
We did. In particular, redheads in ancient Greece were believed to be vampires when they die because they had red hair. That was literally all there was to it.
Yeah, like redheads were believed to be these supernatural soulless beings. And I think that carried into ancient Rome, and there's all this baggage around that, which we break down in our first vampires episode, which is way back, but it's a good one.
So while I don't think that Cleopatra actually had red hair, like, let's be honest here, I mean, it's possible, but I really don't think it. I really do hope that Boudicca had red hair, but it's just as likely that she wasn't a ginger and that this hair color was given to her to make her more fierce and more unlike the Romans. Because red hair in Rome was rare, and it would have taken lots of dye or a good wig maker to achieve. So the idea of natural red hair was something pretty unnatural to most Romans.
As a chef, I know flavor doesn't begin in the kitchen. It begins on the land. And Westhome's nature-led Australian Wagyu is a story written in the landscape of Northern Australia. Cooking is storytelling, and Westholme Wagyu carries a story of Northern Australia itself. Raw, powerful, and deeply authentic. It's a testament to the passion and care raised in the rhythm of Northern Australia. I'm Chef Maylin from 88 Club in Los Angeles, and I invite you to visit westhome.com/Maylin to learn more. And taste a story only Westholme nature-led Australian Wagyu can tell. That's westhome.com/MEILIN.
Hello everyone, Takuya here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
Throughout history, royals across the world were notorious for incest. They married their own relatives in order to consolidate power and keep their blood blue. But they were oblivious to the havoc all this inbreeding was having on the health of their offspring. From Egyptian pharaohs marrying their own sisters to the Habsburgs' notoriously oversized lower jaws. I explore the most shocking incestuous relationships and tragically inbred individuals in royal history. And that's just episode 1. On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. I'm Lindsay Holiday, and I'm spilling the tea on history. Join me every Tuesday for new episodes of the History Tea Time podcast, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
So, to recap, Boudicca was possibly an unusually tall, possibly redheaded teenager when Claudius first came to England. She was from a high-born family, that's pretty well known, and she no doubt heard all the news about the southern tribes rebelling under Caractacus, their devastating loss, and Caractacus having to flee to Wales to continue the fight. Her own tribe, meanwhile, the Iceni, made peace and paid tribute to the Romans. So, who were the Iceni? The Iceni lived in the east of England, where modern-day Norfolk is located. They lived in an area that was mostly lowlands, and their primary exports were their exquisite metalwork and horses. They must have been very secure in their tribal lands because archaeology tells us that they didn't have many hill forts. I mean, possibly because they lacked hills, because it's kind of hard to have a hill fort without a hill to put it on. And that their strongholds were potentially shared with their tribal neighbors and allies, the Trinovantes.
However, because of the destruction to this area, even the fact that they don't have vitrified hill forts or any hill forts is hard to say for sure. This area was razed to the ground during the Roman occupation, and the only evidence we have of any kind of gathering of both the Iceni and the Trinovantes is this massive it's a cache, but not a cache the way you're thinking, it's this massive amount of brooches that have been excavated in the area, dating from around the time of Boudicca's rebellion. Historians believe that the place where the brooches were excavated may have been used as a gathering place for the tribes, maybe as Boudicca staged one of her first battles.
Were these all brooches that were excavated in one place, on a hill that seemed to be a gathering place?
So I was reading a modern historian who was talking about this, and what they were saying was they weren't buried in the ground when we find the sacrificed brooches or things like that.
Yeah, that was my other question is, if you have, a cache of brooches, I'm kind of picturing either someone has buried a sack of brooches, which is, their wealth, and they intend to, return for it later, or they maybe broke the brooches and they are burying them as a sacrifice. And that's not what's happening here, right?
That's not what's happening here. What's happening here, they believe, is so many people were gathered together in what might have been a staging ground for a battle or a big meeting hall, that they were jostled around and that brooches actually just fell off and were sort of trampled into the ground, and later on were found over this wide area that they think would have been an ancient hall. So they don't think they were broken and put here. They think this was an ancient hall or gathering place, that because at a certain point in time, Boudicca's army may have had up to as many as 120,000 people in it, you would have had so many people jostling together that they just lost some of their brooches. And brooches are found so commonly in archaeology more than other things because they were actually pretty easy to lose.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm thinking about like the way that the clothes were back then. Like, I mean, I guess they could sew because I know they found needles that like come from, you know, even the Paleolithic. I'm sure people knew how to sew, but I think that the way that clothes were constructed was like really simply, and a lot of clothing, this is true of the Romans, and I think it's true of Celtic cultures with their, you know, really big cloaks. A lot of the time your clothing is like a big piece of cloth that you arrange over yourself and then hold in place somehow. In the Celtic cultures, this would have been a big drapey cloak that was held in place with a brooch, or maybe it would have been a tunic that would have been held up at the shoulders with a brooch, like a big ornate pin. So it was, you know, a way to hold your clothes together back before there were buttons and zippers and things like that.
That's why they find so many brooches and earrings. Think about earrings. They fall off a lot too.
I can attest to that.
But yeah, so that's what they think happened here.
People who wear brooches today, and sometimes it's like more decorative, like it's just kind of pinned to your shirt as an accent, as opposed to as, you know, a tool to hold your clothes together.
Yeah, I mean, the way modern fashion tends to incorporate brooches is on your cardigan or on your coat or stuff like that. But at this point in time, the function of a brooch would be to hold your clothes or your cloak or your whatever, to hold it to you so you didn't wind up naked.
You're right. So there's a lot of people in this army who are all of a sudden winding up naked because their brooches fell off in this meeting. And this is why they fought naked with only their torque. I figure it's solved an ancient mystery.
Exactly, we've solved it. That's what they think. And you would imagine if brooches were this important, then they probably would have had other means to hold the clothing together. I imagine needles and stuff like that. Anyway, let's get back to our story now that we've broken down the brooches. The Iceni sided with the Romans quickly after Claudius's invasion began, and they did well out of their partnership. It's hard to know why they sided with the Romans so quickly, whether the Romans made them an offer, a bribe, promises of many ornate busts of Julius Caesar.
How many busts? Exactly 6?
Exactly 6. Whatever was promised, it was an offer they couldn't refuse. Or maybe the Iceni had seen enough of Roman might to understand that fighting them would be a losing battle. We don't know what persuaded the Iceni to become a client kingdom of the Romans. I suspect a fairly hefty gift or bribe from Claudius would have done the trick, but we do know that for many years they paid their tributes, traded with Romans, and ruled their lands with a Roman-approved tribal leader.
I mean, I suspect that they thought that if they just kind of gave lip service to the Romans, they'd go away, which is what happened 100 years ago. But who knows? We don't have that documented. So the Iceni were also horse lords. They were expert horse breeders and horse tamers. They would have worshipped the horse goddess Epona. Her name literally means horse. And they were expert metal workers, as we've talked about. We know this from archaeological discoveries of astounding metalwork found in Iceni territory. The Snedegem torque, which is one of the most famous and ornate Celtic torques ever found, was found in Iceni territory and dates to around the time of Boudicca's rebellion. And I kind of want to do a mini-sode about that and maybe some other really cool metalwork finds in Iceni territory. What do you think, Jen?
I'm down for it.
The Iceni recycled the gold that they used from earlier items, but they must have imported silver as it wasn't naturally occurring. They didn't have silver mines. They also didn't have gold mines. They didn't have mines, is what I'm picking up, right? Maybe they had tin mines?
They had tin and copper, definitely. I don't know about gold, but I know that they didn't have silver. So the idea that they were making things out of silver, particularly coins, means that they had to be trading with people outside of their tribe.
So anyway, what this suggests is that the Iceni were on the British trade routes, which means that they were not isolated from the outside world. And that's important because one kind of more modern narrative about the Iceni is that the Romans left them alone because they were kind of out in a backwater and nobody cared about them and they kind of just lived in the woods. And that's not the case.
That's not the case at all. They were a part of what was going on. They saw what was going on in the world around them and to their tribes around them. They weren't just off on their own doing their own thing.
So the Iceni made their own coins. This is from pre-Roman times, right? Or did they start making coins after the Romans came?
I believe there are some from pre-Roman times, but what we see is during Roman times, we actually see writing on the coins, which we can sort of identify as probably being Latin. What we see at this particular point in time is that the Iceni were minting coins. during the time of Boudicca's revolt and just before, that we can actually read. And we can read them as having characters like that say ICEN, meaning Iceni. So this was probably in Latin, I would imagine, so that the Romans they were trading with could also read who they were, and that might have been a more common tongue.
They didn't write things down. I mean, that's the whole thing about being Celtic and Druidism, so I think it would have been Latin letters. You know, this was a Romanization thing.
Exactly. I'll put in the show notes the different examples of the coins that we have found, but there is very famously one that says ICEN. There's no I. It's got a horse on it. Sometimes on the back it even said who made the coin. There's one that's got like made by this person, and there's definitely a spelling error in their name.
That's cool.
It is really, really cool and fascinating, but it does show that these coins that were being minted now really had a Roman influence. They were trading these coins that had their tribal signifiers, that had their tribal culture on them with the Romans, and they were including things like their tribal name on it so that the Romans or whoever else this coin was passed on to could see that the Iceni were a tribe and they were people who traded with the Romans.
I mean, what's cool about the coins with writing on them is that this is some of the first writing ever found in Britain. And it's not Roman writing, it's Celtic writing using Roman script. So the Iceni stayed a Roman allied tribe for roughly 17 years, and for most of that time, they didn't cause the Romans much trouble. But there was one time before Boudicca's rebellion that they did cause trouble, that the Iceni told the Romans they could fuck right the fuck off.
They did. The Iceni had been living under Roman rule for about 4 years. It had been an uneasy time, but mostly a peaceful one for the Iceni. I mean, we talked about this when we rehearsed it. Essentially, it was kind of like a quarantine where you can see all the awful things going on in the world outside of you, and you're kind of like, if I stay in my bubble and I stay in my lane, things should be okay, right?
Don't look to the right, don't look to the left, just look ahead and keep walking and don't make any trouble and we'll be fine. We'll be just fine.
Yeah, and this worked for a while, but then the Romans installed a new governor of the British province, Publius Ostorius Scapula.
Oh, I remember Scapula.
Oh, I remember Scapula too.
How could you forget?
You can't. Scapula was the second governor of the British province, and he was not taking any shit from anyone.
He was a hard ass.
He'd seen enough uprisings. He knew how fragile the Roman hold was on his province, and he decided that all the allied Celtic tribes in the province needed to throw down their weapons and submit to Roman rule.
Even though they already had submitted to Roman rule because they were allies, he wanted them to go just this one step farther.
The Iceni were not okay with this. They were happy to work with Rome. I mean, I don't know if they were happy, but they were willing to. They gave them tributes and traded with them, but they were proud Celtic warriors. They were metal workers. They were not about to throw down their swords and just obey these outsiders. So the Iceni rose up and rebelled against Scapula. The battle went down at a hill fort, most likely Stonia Camp near Cambridge. Whose hill fort was this? We don't know because we've just spent some time saying that the Iceni didn't really have hills or hill forts.
Right, so this might have been like a Trinovantes fort, like an allied neighbor's fort.
That's what I think. They don't mention the other sort of allied people fighting with them, but I can assume, and I think you can assume, that if this was happening to the Iceni, it was happening to everyone else, and they were all pissed off about it at the same time.
They just called up the Trinovantes, and they're like, hey, can we have the keys to your hill fort for like a weekend?
They were like, fuck yeah, and we'll tell you why in a little bit. So, yeah, maybe one of the neighboring tribes let them borrow their hill fort for the weekend, because they also didn't agree with a no weapons ban. The ancient sources don't tell us which one if this is the case. Anyway, after a hard-fought battle, Scapula stormed the fort and managed to put down the revolt. The archaeological evidence of what happened is really gruesome. Jenny, do you remember that? I can't remember exactly what happened.
Well, this is just the Wikipedia page about Stonia Camp, which was a hill fort, I guess adjacent to Iceni territory. I forget exactly where it was, but they found skeletons in the hill fort with sword marks on them dating from around this time, including the skull of a child that had been cleaved in two with like a bladed weapon, like an axe or a sword, I think.
Yeah, which is horrifying. Once this revolt was put down, the Iceni must have had something the Romans really wanted to trade, because they were allowed to remain independent as long as they gave up their weapons. And we know that wasn't the case for other tribes, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the Romans didn't just enslave everybody right then is, I don't know what it tells us, but it tells us something.
It tells us there was something there that the Romans valued or wanted from the Iceni that we don't know. And the Roman sources don't tell us what that thing is either, because potentially it might be something that put them in a negative light. They might have had good grazing land. They might have been where the Romans were planting things to feed everyone.
They could have done that without the Iceni there, though. You know, they could have taken the grazing land and the agricultural land. Like, we don't really know what's going on. So the Iceni this time ruled over and decided that they would do what the Romans told them and disarm themselves and get rid of their weapons. Their old king had either fallen in battle or he was deposed by the Romans, and a new king was crowned. A new Roman-approved, Roman-allied king who was going to play ball. And that was, how do I say this? Prasutagus.
Prasutagus.
Prestegosaurus.
Oh boy.
Prestegosaurus was... He was a dinosaur, kind of an old-fashioned guy.
He was pro-Roman.
The thing about Prestegosaurus is he was okay with throwing away his sword because he still had that very spiky tail.
He did. He had a really spiky tail. He had those, like, spiked ridges all along his back. He was a Prestegosaurus. It's fine.
Were those ridges just for defense, or, you know, did they have, like, blood vessels? Were they kind of an erogenous zone? We don't know.
We don't know, and we are not going to be writing weird dinosaur Iron Age king erotica on this podcast, Jenny Williamson.
I bet Boudicca knew.
Oh, we know Boudicca knew.
But she's not telling us, so we're just going to speculate filthily.
I mean, I don't think I can stop you, so...
Prestegosaurus and his wife, Boudicca, ruled together over the Iceni for 13 years, and those were prosperous years for their tribe. Everything was fine. It was fine. Just don't step out of line and it's fine. Until it wasn't. Prestegosaurus fell ill and died in 60 AD. We don't know much more about his death, except that the ancient sources seem to say that it was natural. He was a pragmatic king, and he wanted his kingdom to be secure once he passed away. He and Boudicca hadn't had any sons, but they did have daughters. I mean, he was, you know, Prestegosaurus was a pragmatic king. He was salt of the earth.
Yeah, I mean, as salt of the earth as a noble dinosaur can be, but sure.
That's right. He was a noble dinosaur king, salt of the earth, gives you the shirt off his back.
Great, giant golden torque that he goes naked into battle with.
I mean, look, he doesn't need a lot of clothing in battle anyway, because he has natural occurring armor.
Oh, Prasutagus, I'm so sorry this is happening to your memory.
I bet he'd love it.
Probably.
What I'm trying to say is that Prestegosaurus and Boudicca didn't have any sons, but they did have daughters. And this wasn't that major of a concern for Prestegosaurus or his people. He was happy for his kingdom to pass on to his daughters to rule once they came of age. And I think that what we basically know about women in Celtic law, what I know anyway, comes from Brehon law, which I believe is Irish and from about 1,000 years or so in the future. So it's a little bit iffy, but the picture we get is that women did have a lot more status in this culture than women did in ancient Greece and Rome, including, you know, their ability to own and inherit property. And also, dinosaurs aren't sexist. So he had absolutely no problem with his kingdom going to his daughters.
I'm really glad to hear that dinosaurs aren't sexist. That really, that warms the cockles of my cold, dead heart.
What is a cockle?
I'm going to Google it. Oh, okay. So this expression uses the corruption of the Latin name for the heart's ventricles. So the coccali cordis would mean ventricles. And so when you say it warms the cockles, you're literally saying it warms the ventricles of my heart.
Interesting. I didn't know that. So, I'm trying to talk about this will. So, Prestegosaurus had a will drawn up which stated that half of his kingdom would be left to the emperor and the other half to his daughters once they came of age. And this was a very strategic, wily move. It was a Roman move. A move that spoke of a dinosaur man who had submitted to the rule and laws of his Roman occupiers and who wanted to make sure that they were not going to find any way to screw him over here. They were going to be appeased. He was trying to appease the Romans and ensure that there was something left of his kingdom to pass on. I don't know exactly what was going on here with Prestegosaurus, like if he had Roman citizenship at this time, because what we do know about Britons who attained Roman citizenship is that a lot of the time it would have been somebody like him who was a ruler of a tribe that the Romans wanted to keep loyal at this point in history. And if you had citizenship, you were allowed to pass things down to your heirs, but if you didn't, you were not.
Yeah, the assumption I got in the research was certainly that historians seem to think that he believed he had Roman citizenship. Now, whether or not he did or didn't, or whether or not Nero decided not to honor things that Claudius gave people 13 years ago, we'll never know exactly. But the belief is that he made this will in particular to make sure that his lands would pass to his daughters.
Right. So theoretically, this should have been ironclad and honored, but who the fuck knows? Prestegosaurus was a king, after all.
Yeah, his word should have been law in his own kingdom.
You would think that, but there's one major problem here. Prestegosaurus began his reign during the rule of Claudius, but he died during the rule of Nero.
So essentially his major problem is a Nero-shaped, ginger, neck-bearded problem.
Nero Neckbeard enters the story.
Yep, it's time to talk about our favorite neck-bearded emperor. So Nero was living it up in Rome. He just had his mother, Agrippina the Younger, executed. He divorced his wife, Octavia, and he's living his best life with his mistress-turned-wife, Sabine. With his mom dead and his, royal stepsister wife out of the picture, there were now no checks on Nero's power. Nobody was reining him in. And things in Rome were going to get really, really wild, according to the ancient sources.
Things were about to get extremely out of hand.
Shit was going to go down.
That's right.
So Nero's advisors, including the statesman, author, and now financier, somehow he managed to become Nero's master of coin. And yes, I know that's not a real job, but it's effectively, that's what it was. Fuck you, Seneca was getting a bit exhausted with all the fighting going on in Britain. Because while things had been quiet and relatively peaceful in the Iceni kingdom for the 13 years of Prestegosaurus' reign, this wasn't the case in other areas of Roman Britain. In fact, the vast majority of Rome's military might in Britain was currently engaged to subdue the Druid uprising in a place called Mona, or Anglesey. And we did a whole episode on this. It's called Anglesey, the Druid's Last Stand. In case you missed it, here's a basic recap. While the Iceni were living a relatively prosperous life as Roman allies, those who refused to submit to Roman rule had fled to Wales, which quickly became a center for Celtic resistance. The island of Anglesey, off the coast of northwest Wales, was both a refuge for displaced people fleeing Roman violence and a major center of power for the Druids. Protected by deadly straits called swellies between the island and the mainland, the Druids supported and egged on the resistance fighters.
Around the time of Prestegosaurus' death, the bulk of the Roman forces, the seasoned soldiers, the people who really knew what they were doing, were off in Wales fighting the Druids. They were led by the governor at the time, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. Scapula, the governor who had made the Iceni give up their swords, had died 8 years ago, and there had been a number of governors since then. This is a job with high turnover. The governors of Britain keep dying. Why? I have no idea. To understand why it's important what's going on in Anglesey right now, you have to understand a little bit about the geography of the UK. So Norfolk, where the Iceni were based, is in the southeast of England, about 100 miles northeast of London, and Mona, or Anglesey, is an island off the northwest coast of Wales. So the bulk of the Roman forces were concentrated on the other side of the British Isles, both north-south-wise and east-west-wise. They were about 300 miles away. This meant that the Romans running the show in the Iceni territory were doing it without the support of their seasoned soldiers, who were all the way over on the other end of the island fighting the Druids. It was like a skeleton crew in Iceni territory right now. And that was a problem for the Romans because while they were busy in Mona, there was unrest brewing in the southeast.
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
Calling all kids in the car. Brittany and Meredith here from the chart-topping Family Road Trip Trivia podcast. Are you dreading another silent car ride with the fam? We've got the cure. 3 rounds of fresh trivia every single week. Movies, music, even science and Disney. We've got something for every trivia buff in the car. No more crickets chirping on those long journeys. The Family Road Trip Trivia podcast is your secret weapon for connecting and laughing with kids of all ages. Teens, toddlers, adults, it doesn't matter. Spark their curiosity and challenge their brains with every episode. New episodes drop weekly wherever you get your podcasts. Search for the Family Road Trip Trivia podcast and turn those car rides into epic adventures.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley Livesey from the History of the Second World War podcast. My podcast is a mostly chronological retelling of the Second World War, and I hope you will join me on a journey through the most cataclysmic conflict in human history, as we try to answer the questions of not just what and where, but how and why. Join me on a journey not just through the famous campaigns, battles, and events, but also on a trip around the globe as we broaden the scope of Second World War history beyond the well-known battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. During weekly episodes, I seek to provide new insight for longtime students of the war, while also being a great jumping-on point for anyone seeking a deeper understanding of the Second World War. This podcast has made it to the invasion of Poland in 1939, and start listening now to find out how the world would find itself embroiled in its second worldwide conflict in just 20 years. You can find History of the Second World War on all major podcast platforms or at History of the Second World War.
The Trinovantes, the neighboring tribe of the Iceni, were furious with Rome. The Romans had seized Camalodunum, whose name meant the stronghold of Camulus. Camulus was a Celtic god of war and was sacred to the Trinovantes. And Jenny, you found some stuff about Camulus that I thought was fascinating, so I'm going to let you talk about it.
Yeah, so Camulus was the Celtic god of war, and the thing about Celtic gods, especially Celtic gods that date from the Roman era, is that we know so little about them, especially gods that come from places that the Romans conquered, like Gaul and Britain.
Yeah, because they did a really good job when they came in of sort of erasing the local gods and combining them with their gods. So we see this at Bath. A really good example is temple to Minerva Solis, like Minerva and the sun, but really Solus is not related to Minerva at all. They've just tried to put the two of them together so that people are going there and worshiping their god.
It was like a tool of colonization. And with Camulus, what happened was he got rolled into the god Mars, and a lot of his unique qualities kind of just got erased by the identity of Mars as the years went on. So we don't know that much about Camulus, but we do know a few things. So one of the things about Camulus that sets him apart from Mars is that he was apparently very slow to anger. He doesn't get mad easily, but when his fuse blows, it blows. There were other things about Camulus that it might be interesting to know. Depictions of him often show him wearing ram's horns on his head, and he had an unbreakable sword made of iron. So Camulus was heavily associated with iron. He was believed to guide people to rich iron ore deposits so that they could make swords that would help them defend themselves from their enemies. And it was said that Camulus would search the earth over for the finest iron possible so that he could create the strongest warriors in the world to defend their territory. So he was all about defending what's yours, Camulus. He was a defensive war god and not a colonizing war god. You know what I mean?
Yeah, which is super fascinating.
Yeah, and it's also said that pieces of magnetic iron were believed to be channeling Camulus. Celtic people, in Britain during this time might carry pieces of magnetic iron as a form of protection and to bring a little piece of Camulus's defensive power with them. So that's a little bit that we know about Camulus. But the big thing about Camulus is that he's very slow to anger. but when he does get angry, watch out.
He's a fucking volcano, kids. So, Camulodunum was originally the ancestral home of the Trinovantes. At some point, it was taken over by the Catavolani, Caractacus's people. It might have been taken over several times because this area probably had a significance to lots of different tribes who worshipped Camulus.
If you look at the Roman accounts of what happened when Claudius originally started his invasion of Britain, there's all this conflict there, and apparently the Catavolani were attacking other people and taking over their territory, and this might have been one of the things that happened then, but we don't really know. It's not that clear.
It's not that clear because, the Romans didn't really understand the tribal boundaries.
Right, and maybe the Trinovantes were allies of the Catavolani and just lent them the keys to their Iron Age hill fort. We don't know.
Anyway, but then the Catavolani got defeated by the Romans in the 40s, driving Caractacus out. The Romans seized this area to create a colonia for retired Roman soldiers. And this is really fascinating. The name of this colony is essentially like the Colonia Victorianus Claudius, which is like the colony of the victory of Claudius.
Yeah, and this was like a retirement town for Roman soldiers.
For Roman soldiers. And Roman soldiers, these Roman soldiers who could be retiring there might have served on the British front. They could have served on the Gallic front. They could have served anywhere. Like, where you got your retirement when you retired wasn't necessarily based on where you served or where you had lived the bulk of your life. So this colony had grown in importance until it turned into the capital city of Roman Britain. It was a major center for trade, giving access to vital rivers to bring goods into the UK and out of it.
Meanwhile, here's how the Roman veterans treated the Trinovantes who already lived in the city, and this is a quote from Tacitus's Annals. Quote, "For these new settlers in the colony of Camulodunum drove people out of their houses, ejected them from their farms, called them captives and slaves, and the lawlessness of the veterans was encouraged by the soldiers who lived a similar life and hoped for similar license." I'm assuming these other soldiers here were currently employed in the Roman army and were supposed to keep order, but were clearly not doing that. A temple, also erected to the divine Claudius, was ever before their eyes, a citadel, as it seemed, of perpetual tyranny. Men chosen as priests had to squander their whole fortunes under the pretense of a religious ceremonial. So, the Roman veterans, newly settled in Camulodunum, did not treat the Trinovantes well, according to this quote. They drove them out of their homes, took them into slavery, and were encouraged in their violence by local Roman soldiers who were supposed to keep the peace, but who were not keeping the peace. To make matters even worse, I'm going to talk about this temple here. The Romans built a temple to the deified Claudius, their oppressor, in Camulodunum, that the Trinovantes had to look at every day, probably built over a temple of Camulus.
Yeah, it was built over a temple of Camulus. And now you've got the freaking temple of the deified Claudius. He's not a god. He's just a dude who came in and oppressed them and took their lands. No.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the thing about the priests, because here's what I'm picking up from this. It's a little bit unclear, but the picture that I'm getting about this is that the Romans forced the highest-ranking Trinovantes to work as priests at this temple and or to donate all their material goods to it under the pretense of some kind of a religious ceremony. And this was a way to wipe out their power base, basically. The Trinovantes, understandably, harbored a deep and burning rage against the Romans. They were a powder keg, just waiting for the fuse to go off, and this had been going on for years. Like Camulus, they were slow to anger, but when they angered, watch out.
Boudicca's husband died in 60 AD. At the time, a procurator called Decianus. Yeah, now all I can see is anus.
Decianus catus. Is that Latin for cat anus or what?
I don't like him very much, and as we'll see in episode 2, he kind of is a cat anus, although that's unfair to cats' anuses.
I feel like it's a little bit of an insult to cats, but it does look like cat anus to me.
Let's get back to the 10th cat anus, who I am now just going to call Catus. Decianus Catus.
10th of his name.
Anyway, Decianus Catus was in charge of collecting the taxes and levies against the allied British tribes. He probably wanted to make a name for himself, or at least cement his worth to Nero as someone who could get things done. You know, Nero was a very, fair-weather, moody guy. You want to be the guy who's given him the money for what he wants.
He's very spendy.
So, Decianus.
Cat anus.
So, cat anus!
We can't hold it in.
Anyway, so he decided it was time to call in all the loans that the British tribes owed to Rome. And according to Cassius Dio, quote, an excuse for the war was found in the confiscation of the sums of money that Claudius had given the foremost Britons. For these sums, as Decianus Catus, the procurator of the island, maintained, were to be paid back. This was one reason for the uprising. Another, Seneca, fuck you Seneca, in the hope of receiving a good rate of interest, had lent the islanders 40 million sesterces that they did not want, and had afterwards called in this loan all at once and had resorted to severe measures in exacting it.
What is happening here with this loan?
Yeah, let's unpack this a little bit. According to Dio, the Cadenus decided to call in all the loans on the allied Celtic tribes. And these loans, some dating back to Claudius, might have been seen by the tribes as gifts and not loans. Possibly, they were even given at the time as bribes to get the tribes on side with Rome at the beginning of the invasion, or to maintain good relations at some point after. We don't really have any idea.
Yeah, and then there's this possibility that Seneca had loaned them money that they didn't want, and then immediately called it back, which would make it different than the Claudius loan gifts or whatever bribes.
Yeah, we don't know exactly what's happening here because I don't think Dio knows exactly what's happening because he's writing about 100 years in the future. And this is obviously something that has been muddled. And at this point in time, both Claudius and Seneca's reputations have taken some smackings.
I think that probably the most plausible explanation here is that at the beginning of the Roman invasion, Claudius paid some of these tribes off to get them on side. That's possibly what was happening. And now Seneca was saying, all right, it's time for you guys to pay back that loan that these tribes thought was a gift and not a loan.
But at some point in time, Seneca, according to Dio, gave up 40 million sesterces. We don't know what he gave this enforced loan for. If it was bribes, if it was trying to get, like, the Iceni onto, like, a Roman currency, and that's where maybe some of that silver came from, we don't know.
Yeah, so it's possible that this uprising was a result of cultural confusion over this money. I mean, Jen and I are confused, so it wouldn't surprise me if the Iceni were confused. It's also possible that fuck you Seneca, who was now a high-ranking official in Nero's court and also a grade-A asshole, was starting to see the way the wind was blowing and wanted the money that he'd lent paid back because Nero was a fan of the high life and he was starting to drain the treasury. He was starting to gild all the nipples of everybody in the Praetorian Guard, and that was expensive. The British Isles were a great place to exact some much-needed resources from, whether those resources were taxes, slaves, wood and metal, and other natural resources, or conscripts for Rome's armies. Whatever the actual reasons for this whole debt situation, we do not know. It's possible that the procurator Decianus Catus, 10th of his name, was the one who went tribe to tribe exacting these quote-unquote loans. It's his rapaciousness that ancient writers blame for sparking the rebellion in the first place. Tacitus, in his treatment of Boudicca, is much more matter-of-fact than Dio. He doesn't dwell on salacious details. Instead, he tends to stick to the narrative, and I get the feeling that his account is more trustworthy because he's pulling this information from his father-in-law, Agricola, who actually was in Roman Britain during this time. So Agricola would have been a low-ranking officer who was just starting out. Eventually, he would go on to be the architect of subjugation of the entire island of Britain. But at this time, he was just starting out. He would have been possibly a young aide to Paulinus, who was the general handling the Druidic rebellion at Anglesey and who would be the general to respond to the Boudicca rebellion as well. So he may have been an eyewitness to this stuff. But what's really interesting here is that while Cassius Dio loves the big gory story and all the salacious details, he gives us a very prosaic reason for the Iceni uprising. He's the one who tells us about this debt and tells us that this is the reason why Boudicca rebelled. Tacitus is the one who gives us the more violent origin story of Boudicca.
So, according to Tacitus, the Romans rolled into Iceni territory, probably looking to collect on this giant loan that the Iceni hadn't wanted in the first place, and maybe didn't even realize was a loan at all. We don't know exactly what was said, but it's likely that one, Boudicca, whose husband had just died, did not have the money to pay back this loan. And two, the Romans were not pleased that old Pastosaurus...
Pastosaurus?
What did we call him?
I called him Prostegosaurus.
Prostegosaurus.
Let's, stick with Pastosaurus now. That's fine. That sounds delicious.
They weren't pleased that old Pastosaurus had left half of his tribal lands to his daughters and the other half to Nero.
They wanted it all.
Yeah, they wanted it all. So Decianus Catus told Boudicca and the Iceni that Pastosaurus might have been their king, but that he ruled at the pleasure of Rome. And he had no right to leave a will. Everything he owned, including his people, his wife, and children, were property and subjects of Rome. Also, this is Rome, so women don't inherit shit. Like, don't start getting wild ideas, ladies.
Even if you are a citizen and you have rights to leave things to your descendants, you can't leave things to women. This is Rome. Women don't get to inherit things. Forget it.
Absolutely. We are going to talk about what happened to Boudicca and her daughters, and we're going to talk about rape. If that is something that you're not comfortable hearing about, we will see you in the next episode. Just know something really bad happened. Okay. From here on out, that's what we're talking about. So, to prove that the Romans were the bosses here, they started to debase and humiliate the nobles. We don't know exactly what that means, but we can guess. They enslaved them, and they stripped Boudicca, the queen of the Iceni, and flogged her while her daughters were carried off by soldiers and raped or potentially gang raped.
That's awful.
It's awful. And we know that daughters were young. We know that they were not of marriage age, and that's why when they were given the land to rule, their mother was to rule at their side as their regent.
I would guess they were probably young teenagers at the oldest, because marriageable age in the ancient world was not that old.
Yeah, exactly. So we're talking really about children here, which is awful. So according to Tacitus, this is exactly what happened. Quote, King Pastosaurus, celebrated for his long prosperity, had named the emperor his heir, together with his 2 daughters, an act of deference which he thought would place his kingdom and household beyond the risk of injury. The result was contrary, so much so that his kingdom was pillaged by centurions, his household by slaves, as though they had been prizes of war. As a beginning, his wife Boudicca was subjected to the lash and his daughters violated. All the chief men of the Icenians were stripped of their family estates, and the relatives of the king were treated as slaves.
So what happened to Boudicca and her daughters is the literal use of rape as a weapon of war. Boudicca was stripped and flogged before her people to debase and humiliate not just her, but her whole tribe. She must have objected when the Romans arrived and told her that she was no longer queen, that her lands were no longer hers, that her people would be sold into slavery to pay back a loan that she didn't even realize that she had to pay back, probably. My assumption is that she probably mouthed off. She probably did not take this lying down.
No, I imagine that she was like, excuse me, what now? What's this?
Right.
Yeah, look, we're still mourning the death of our king. We're just getting ourselves sorted. We're not going to deal with this nonsense that you've brought to us. And I can imagine that the Romans at this particular point in time were like, excuse me, we do not take orders from you. You have no right to even do anything or rule because you're just a woman. And the person who's in charge here is Rome until we find a suitable regent, and it won't be you.
Yeah, and so they decided to educate her on her place in the Roman world that she was now inhabiting. So that education would have involved her being stripped, possibly naked, in front of everybody in her tribe and flogged. And flogging in this context does not mean beaten. It means scourging, which we have talked about before. We go into detail about scourging in our episode on the First Servile War, the one about Eunice and the mermaid goddess. And the fact that she was scourged is interesting because scourging was not something you were supposed to live through. It was pretty much always used as a precursor to crucifixion in the Roman world. It's something they really did if they wanted to make an example of you. It involved using a type of whip like a cat o' nine tails with multiple strips of leather that had small pieces of like sharp things like bone or nails or something in it. And that's a whip that's intended to rip flesh from bone. And we have ancient world sources that talk about what this was like. That was basically just like breaking your body open. Like you're not supposed to live through it. It's possible that the Romans might have been planning to crucify Boudicca next to really make an example of her.
I have heard this story many times, and it wasn't until I was in this research that I really started to think that is probably what they wanted to do. Because they had no time for a tribe to rebel in the east of the country when everyone was off fighting in the west. They just needed to put this shit down and move on to the next thing.
Yeah, they needed to come down on them really hard so that this would not turn into a giant conflagration. And also, like, all their more experienced soldiers weren't there, so these were probably, like, not the most experienced guys, so they were probably, like, just bringing the hammer down because they didn't know any other way to handle this.
Yeah, the person in charge had an agenda, and the people he had with him were not as experienced, and I think what you're going to see happening is things really get out of control real quick.
They aren't bringing their A game here. This isn't the cream of the crop Roman soldiers handling this right now. So another clue that the Romans had planned not just rape and scourging, but execution was the rape of Boudicca's daughters. So the ancient Romans didn't believe in killing virgins. And what that meant in practice is that sometimes young women, if they were imprisoned and scheduled for execution, and this happened a couple of times that I've seen in different parts of Roman history, they would be raped in jail before being executed, which is really fucking horrible. So taking Boudicca's daughters off and raping them might have meant that the Romans wanted to execute both Boudicca and her daughters, but before they could do this, because of their beliefs, they had to rape the young virgin princesses of the Iceni tribe because they didn't kill virgins, which is fucking awful.
They were young virgins. They were princesses. They should have been protected. No one has the right to rape anyone ever. This is awful. And the Iceni people were fucking furious. So we don't know exactly what happened next. What would have stopped the Romans from carrying out their plan of potentially crucifying Boudicca, if that was even their plan?
And another thing that makes me think it might have been their plan was the fact that she lived through this scourging. They might have just been getting started when they were stopped.
I totally agree. And like I said, as I was reading, I was like, wow, I never put those pieces together, but it makes a lot of sense. So this insult to the queen of the Iceni and her daughters could not be borne. Honor was at stake for the whole tribe. And it's probable that the tribe rose up right there and drove the Romans out before they were able to either crucify Boudicca or slaughter their princesses. And that would have been quite an achievement because the Iceni people would have been fighting the Romans without swords because, remember, the Romans had forced them to disarm 13 years earlier. This is assuming that they did disarm and didn't keep some swords somewhere.
I suspect that, number one, they probably had some swords hidden under mattresses and things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Or made new ones, as we suggested in our cold open.
Right, exactly. But also, fighting off the Romans without weapons would have been quite the achievement in itself. It's also really remarkable. Or without as many weapons as they normally would have had.
Absolutely. So there's a lot we don't know about the immediate aftermath of the Romans' vicious assault on Boudicca and her family. If she'd been scourged, she probably needed some serious time to heal. But we do know that Boudicca and her daughters and their tribe regrouped, and that Boudicca decided then and there that the Romans would know her fury. They would know the Icenian rage. It was coming their way.
Much like Camulus, they were slow to anger.
It took a while, but it's coming.
That's right.
Boudicca and her people were going to war, and they knew exactly who to recruit to their cause.
So that's it for this week. Join us in 2 weeks for the next installment in the story of Boudicca. And in the meantime, come find us on social at Ancient Hist Fan on Twitter or Ancient History Fangirl on Facebook and Instagram.
We have new merch! Well, probably by now you've seen it already, but it's new to us right now. We have the link on our website, ancienthistoryfangirl.com. And I'm so excited that we have a design for the inimitable livers.
Inimitable livers.
Inimitable livers.
We actually launched this and then we realized that it was spelled wrong in the design, so we had to relaunch. It was somebody on Twitter pointed it out and neither of us had seen it. And we were just like, oh crap. And then we had to relaunch it. But now it's spelled correctly.
This is what happens when you mispronounce things enough times that you start thinking the mispronunciation is the correct way to spell it.
That's right. We now have an Inimitable Livers t-shirt for the Inimitable Livers Drinking Club, founded 41 BC. You can have...
By Antony and Cleopatra.
You can have the official Antony and Cleopatra Drinking Club merch. I hopefully have my t-shirt in the mail by the time this episode goes up. I'm really excited.
Me too. And in addition to supporting us by picking up some new merch, you can also maybe join our Patreon. Starting at just $2 a month, you get ad-free episodes dropping a whole day early, plus extra episodes that don't play in our main feed. There are side quests and our drunken hangouts with some of your favorite podcasters.
So we have some Patreon members to thank, don't we, Jen?
We do. Thank you so much to our first imitative liver, Ben Aronovich.
Thank you, Ben. Hildegun Winther.
Joy Taylor.
Okay. Just okay. Spelled with an E.
Stephanie L. Hawk.
Mark Finley.
Marie Hicks.
Peter and Kathy.
Amy McFarland.
Amber Davis.
Boulder 12.
Catherine Skehan.
Megan Williams.
Donald Moeller.
Aaron Robbins.
Virginia Owl.
Chris Cash.
Megan Shade.
Becca Shamrock.
Cassandra Morrison.
Ellen Flagel.
And Kevin McLaughlin. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for listening, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. This episode was sponsored by the Time Travel Rome app. This app is Google Maps for ancient Rome. You get detailed maps of over 5,000 ancient sites and monuments from all over the Roman Empire, from North Africa to northern Britain.
Click on those sites and you'll get detailed information on history and context, including over 300 contemporary texts giving you the perspectives of the ancients in their own words, plus pictures. This is an essential travel app for anyone who's a huge history nerd. If you love to explore ancient sites when you travel, you'll always know what historical sites are around you, exactly how to get to them, and never get lost again. I get lost all the time. This is important to me.
Of course, many of us can't travel right now with the pandemic, but the Time Travel Rome app lets you explore virtually. And if you happen to live within the bounds of the ancient Roman Empire, the Time Travel Rome app could show you dozens of historical sites you may not have known were there. Get to know the history of your area while you wait for the world to open up.
There's even a feature where you can see ancient Roman roads transposed over modern highways and roads and modern maps, so you can really follow in the ancient Romans' footsteps. Get the Time Travel app at the App Store for iPhone and Google Play for Android. Check out timetravelrome.com for more information.
This was a cauterizing fire. Her army is coming. You've heard the rumors, you and the other women who live in Camulodunum, though they do not call it that now. You've gathered at the well in the mornings, exchanging hushed and panicked news in the old tongue, not the bastard Latin. Your mother used to say that the king of the Iceni was a peaceful man, wise and slow to anger, but now his queen Boudicca rules, and she walks with the warrior goddess Andraste. She will cut the lying tongues from every Roman mouth. She will scorch her vengeance into the earth. Part of you wishes you had the courage to run to the edge of the city and welcome her, because you feel a kinship. You've heard what the Romans did to her and her daughters. They've done the like to you and your own sisters. The Romans have taken from all of you. Your husband tells you not to be foolish, that Boudicca won't make exceptions for women who live with Roman soldiers. Of course, he isn't Roman himself. His homeland is beyond the sea, in a land called Thrace. The Romans took his land, enslaved his people, and he tells you the only way he avoided a life in the mines was to enlist in the army. 20 years he served in their war machine, and this city, your city, Camulodunum, this was to be his retirement. When he bought you at the slave market, you never hated anyone more. Now he has made you his wife. You told yourself that this was the best life you would get, a girl of the Trinovantes, whose only alternative is slavery. But now Boudicca's army gives you a dangerous hope. Her army is on the horizon. The rich of the city have fled to Gaul or Londinium, but your husband has stayed. There is nowhere for him to go. Not that he would. He doesn't believe in running from a battle. Now the army is here. Your husband tells you to run, to take refuge at the temple of Claudius. The walls are strong and new. It is defensible. He will see you on the other side. You gather with the other women and children, a few of the city guard to defend the doors. At first, the atmosphere is hushed but confident. The men have been through worse. They all have tales of surviving sieges or sacking cities. This will all be over in a few hours when the 9th Legion joins their forces. Those who can eat. Those who are afraid, whose terror is too great, drink unwatered wine. Some sleep. You wait. You think it is night, but cannot be sure. You have thought of what you'll do should the man who forces you to call him husband fail. You'll fall upon your knees and ask Queen Boudicca to take mercy on you, to allow you to join her army, to find others from your tribe and liberate them too. You've rehearsed the lines over and over in your head. Now you can smell the fires. At first they were far enough away that you weren't afraid, but now they are so close. The dim light from the oil lamps in the temple cast ominous shadows on the walls. Everyone is quiet now. And then the noise comes. The sounds of clashing swords, the calls of horns, the cries of men fighting and dying, fierce and frantic just outside the doors. A great booming crash as you hear them try to force the door. And then nothing. The doors have held, and for a moment you are grateful to the Romans and this hideous, horrible building. Everyone starts to laugh and cheer. But then the sound starts up again, axes and swords hacking at the doors, and always the smell of burning drawing closer. Everyone falls silent, and suddenly there's a new sound. The sounds of feet scrambling from above, the crash of shattering tiles. They're on the roof. I'm Jen McMenemy.
And I'm Jenny Williamson, and this is Ancient History Fangirl.
And we're back.
That was a real cheery intro.
Yeah, so Jen has been spending all of her third British lockdown in Roman Britain during Boudicca's rebellion.
You know shit has gotten really bad when she started referring to herself in the third person, like Julius Caesar.
Oh yeah, like the dude who just likes to pop into the podcast if you say his name 3 times. You're warned, Jenny. We've got it once now.
He doesn't appear to be counting. You know, this isn't about him.
Yeah, you try telling him that. Anyway, in our last episode, we laid the seeds of Boudicca's rebellion. We told you about how the Roman conquest of Britain was shaping up in the 60s AD. How in the west of the UK, in Wales, a rebellion, led by Druids, was keeping the bulk of the Roman forces very, very busy. While in the east of the UK, mostly in Norfolk, Essex, and London, the Roman forces were very understaffed, believing that the British tribes in the east were subdued, or at the very least, in an uneasy peace with the Roman colonizers. The Romans felt that they could focus on other things besides maintaining a muscular military force there. So muscular. Gaston levels of, Gaston from Beauty and the Beast. I've now got the Gaston song in my head.
Just stop there. Just, you know what? The word muscular was clearly not the right word.
Who wrote this episode? Oh, wait.
I think that was my edit, though. I'm sorry. It's my fault.
So mainly what the Romans were doing there was collecting crippling taxes and calling in extortionate loans from their allies, because that's how you be a good friend to your allies.
As you can imagine, this whole extortionate loan collecting and crippling taxes and shit, this did not engender good relations between the Roman oppressors and the tribes that they were oppressing. The tribes now allied to Rome, some voluntarily or, with a gun to their head voluntarily, like Boudicca's tribe, and some because they were conquered, were furious that the Romans wanted to collect on quote-unquote loans which had been given to the tribes, possibly without their consent, possibly without them realizing that they were loans and not bribes or gifts to begin with, and we go into that in more depth in the previous episode if you want to know what the whole deal is with these weird loans. And into this toxic stew, we have a final fatal ingredient. The king of the Iceni, are we calling him Pastosaurus or Prostegosaurus?
We've called him both. I feel like you're Prostegosaurus and I somehow always go to the pasta.
All right, I'm just going to stick with Prostegosaurus, but I have no control over what Jen does with her mouth when she's talking about this dude, so Prostegosaurus kicked the bucket. He went tits up. He shuffled off the mortal coil. He's dead. His reign had been a long and mostly prosperous one for the Iceni. He'd been appointed by the Romans after the Iceni's earlier rebellion, and then he'd led his people through turbulent times, and his dying wishes had been to keep the peace with Rome by leaving half of his kingdom to the Emperor Nero and the other half to his daughters.
The Iceni didn't have problems with women inheriting kingdoms, but the Romans had other ideas. They refused to honor Postosaurus's will. He was, after all, only given the right to rule because the Romans had appointed him. He had no rights to pass along his kingdom or his property. His kingdom and everything in it belonged to Rome. And besides, women weren't people, especially two underage girls. So the Romans, led by a man named Decianus Catus, or Cadinus the 10th
of his name,
refused to honor Postosaurus's will.
I actually looked into this when we were editing this podcast, and I'm not 100% clear what the rules were in ancient Rome about women inheriting property. I think there were times when they could and situations where they could, but I don't think that that was true throughout the Roman Empire. I'm not sure if it was true then, but I also kind of don't think that in this instance it was about who was inheriting the kingdom. I think they just wanted the kingdom, right?
So number one, yes. I mean, essentially what they wanted was they wanted money, or I'm assuming they wanted to enslave people, but I think the Iceni had some natural things in their area that they wanted. And this was just an excuse to come and take that from them. But the reality is that Postosaurus, which is ridiculous to call him that, but that's what I'm calling him. He was a client king, and at this point in time, he may or may not have been given Roman citizenship as part of his being a ruler here. And what he did with this will, believing that he had the good faith of Rome, who was his ally, was say, right, as a person who has rights in Rome and rights in my country, this is what I do with my property. These are your rules, I'm following them. You can see his logic here. The problem is the Romans just do what the fucking Romans want to do.
Well, the thing about citizenship, the general thing that was happening in the very early first decades of Britain as a Roman province is that the Romans were giving out citizenship to some of the people in Roman Britain, some of the tribal British leaders, and they would give out that citizenship basically to influential tribal leaders that they wanted to keep on side. And Stegosaurus absolutely would have qualified. One of the things about being a Roman citizen in Roman Britain is that Roman citizens, including Romano-British Roman citizens, got to leave property to their families in their will. Whereas if you did not have citizenship in Roman Britain and you were a British person, you were not allowed to leave things to your family. Everything you had went to the Roman state. So I do kind of wonder if he had citizenship and believed he was allowed to will things to other people, and the Romans just trampled all over that in this instance. Or maybe he didn't have citizenship and just kind of misconstrued things, and no one pulled him aside and told him about this rule that he had to leave everything to the Romans. But I kind of think he would have had citizenship because he's the kind of person at this point who would have. He was an influential in the region, Rome-appointed tribal leader.
I think the reality is he believed that he had citizenship and he had the right to leave this to his children with his wife as regent, or else he wouldn't have written a Roman will. Like, he honestly believed that he had this right. Whether or not the Romans also believed it, there was a change in leadership or whatever happened, Postosaurus believed he was playing by the Roman rules. He was telling Rome how when he was gone, he wanted his tribal kingdom to be ruled. And he felt that if we are allies and I'm keeping the peace and I'm going to ensure a smooth transfer of power, this is how it will be done.
Right. I think it makes more sense that he had citizenship and the Romans were just trampling on it than that he didn't.
Yeah, but we don't know, but that is what I think.
Again, we don't know.
No, because the Romans didn't tell us, because why would they?
Because it makes them look bad if that's what happened. That's why they wouldn't tell us.
I mean, don't get me started. So when Postosaurus's widow, Boudicca, decided to challenge the Romans' decision to ignore her husband's will and take her entire kingdom from her and her daughters, well, all hell broke loose. The Romans flogged Boudicca and her daughters were raped by Roman soldiers, and the Iceni people rose up. We don't know exactly how the Romans were booted out of the Iceni lands or villages, but we know that shit went down, because the Roman forces who'd arrived to collect on that fraudulent loan were booted out of Iceni territory pretty quickly.
We can just imagine there was much blood, maybe some heads were lost. The Celts did like to take a nice head or two when they went to war. That was kind of their thing.
It was their thing. I mean, look, it was their love language.
Look, if you're not taking heads, are you even at war?
Are you even?
Anyway, whatever happened, the Iceni were done playing nice. They were done being ruled by Rome. They'd tried it the Roman way. They'd tried it the peaceful way. There was only one way left. All-out war. So that's where we left it in our last episode, with the Iceni preparing for war. And before we get to what happened next, we have to turn our attention to the Roman settlement at a town called Camulodunum, close to Iceni territory. So we started to tell you about Camulodunum in our last episode, but to really understand what this town represented and why it's relevant to Boudicca's story and the conditions she lived in, we have to delve a little more into it.
Camulodunum was the capital of Roman Britain. It's easy to think that Londinium, the precursor to modern London, would have been the capital city. It's further inland, it's closer to both the east and west of the British Isles, but Londinium wasn't the capital. The Romans put their capital in Essex, near to the sea, and also to the Thames and the estuary that gave the Romans access to cities and towns further inland. Camulodunum was originally a native British town. Before the Romans got there, it had been the stronghold of local tribes. First, the Trinovantes, then the Catavolani, and possibly other tribes as well. It's possible this particular bit of land went back and forth and changed hands.
I believe it was the ancestral town of the Trinovantes tribe, and then the Catavolani, led by Caratacus, possibly Caratacus' father, I'm not 100% sure, took it over possibly around the time Claudius's legions were coming over. At one point, it was Caratacus' stronghold, but I don't think it was rightfully his, but it was the Trinovantes' ancestral town, from what I understand, right?
Yes, and it's possible that for a time the Trinovantes were allied with Rome because they wanted Rome to help them get their land back. And Rome, much like a vampire, wanted an invitation into the homeland for a justified war. Come on now, they wanted to Dracula this shit.
Oh, they totally wanted to Dracula this shit. You're so right.
So anyway, the town of Camulodunum had significance to both of these very important tribes. But it was also the sacred town of Camulus, the British god of war. And he was a slow-to-anger god of war. Not at all expansionist-minded. He was more about the protection of his people. He was here to support you and keep you safe. Maybe put some CBD oil in your tea, and then if he must, he would rise up and slay your enemies.
Oh man, Camulus is just my type of war god.
He really is, because he would be there quiet, and you'd be like, oh, is this guy ever going to get angry? And then once he got angry, you better watch out. Camulus is coming for you.
Look out.
There will be no survivors.
Yeah. Prior to Roman occupation, when it was controlled by the Trinovantes and then the Catavolani, Camulodunum had been a pretty built-up Iron Age Celtic city. It had a series of protective dikes and ditches, like a dike is a turf barrier thing.
With water, I imagine.
Did it have moats?
Just gone with what it said. I just always imagine a dike is like a dam and it's holding back some kind of water or moving water around, but it could be wrong.
I kind of pictured this as it had some earthworks, but I could be wrong on that.
We could all be wrong. Archaeology doesn't exactly know because Boudicca burned there.
Right, so it had a series of protective dikes, interpret dikes as you will, and it was the biggest tribal settlement in the area. Interestingly, was not a walled city though.
It wasn't a walled city. It was the biggest, tribal area, but that makes sense because they didn't wall their cities.
This was not a hill fort at the time.
No. And the interesting thing is that the Romans didn't actually take the time to wall the city themselves. Unlike Londinium, which they did wall.
That's going to become important later. Anyway, so Camulodunum was not a hill fort. It was an unwalled city with a series of protective dikes, which might be earthworks, they might involve water, unclear. It was the biggest tribal settlement in the area. According to Vanessa Collingridge in her book Boudicca, quote, Camulodunum became the largest settlement in southeast Britain at around 10 square miles in area, with a series of protective dikes for defense. Although essentially not much more than a large farm with some specialist zoned areas, the settlement had an importance that was political, religious, and economic in nature, with its own burial grounds and a mint producing a range of coins. So essentially, the Iron Age city of Camulodunum had everything that a Roman settlement needed ready-made. It had strong defenses, a position controlling important waterways, it had rich farmland. All the Romans had to do was come along and appropriate it. And that's what they did. They pushed out the British tribes living there, and they took the land for themselves. And as we've said, this was a great move for the Romans. In addition to getting a well-defended location that controlled major trade routes and waterways with great farmland besides, this town and its surrounding area was culturally important to the British tribes. It was the sacred stronghold of Camulus. The fact that the Romans controlled it now sent a message. Not even your god of war can defend against us.
So there was one drawback to Camulodunum for the Romans, though. It was a British town. Probably not carefully planned the way the Romans like their cities. But if the city wasn't exactly up to Roman standards, well, they could fix that. They could grid out the entire area and make it perfectly planned. And according to Vanessa Collingridge, that's exactly what the Romans did. Vanessa Collingridge wrote an excellent biography on Boudicca, and she was one of the main sources for this episode and the series in general. And I just want to make sure we shout her out in the podcast because she was integral to us being able to tell this story. So here's the quote. Quote, "Slowly but surely, Camulodunum became a typically Roman town. However, rather than erase all signs of its British past and start the town from scratch, the Romans built their legionary fortress and a number of other military buildings, but left intact many of the key features of the Iron Age settlement, some of which are still visible today. Although relatively few of the invaders would actually have come from Italy, let alone Rome itself, the Romans were essentially an urban people with cosmopolitan ideas. On top of that, they were a people who were used to colonizing new frontiers, almost like painting by numbers. They had a well-established culture of town planning, with many provincial settlements following a basic plan involving a mix of military, economic, social, and religious functions."
Here's the part where we take a pause and talk about the Roman colonial machine. Rome had gotten colonization down to a science at this point in its empire. It knew exactly how to go into a foreign territory, subjugate the native population, and then go about setting up a Roman province. It actually had a step-by-step plan for this. First, you went in with your soldiers, with your legions and legions of fresh fighting men, and if possible, they went in and exploited pre-existing tribal conflicts to get some of the tribes on side to conquer other tribes. And they called that making peace with the tribal people because they were allying with some of the tribal people to subjugate other people.
Absolutely. What you did was you went in, you made some kind of uneasy alliances, as Jenny said, by exploiting tribal conflicts or cold hard cash and bribes. Like, let's be honest, not everyone is above being bribed. And if that didn't work, you just sent in your fucking Roman war machine.
Right, and after the war, you had to build the idea of a Roman town. According to Vanessa Collingridge in her incredible book, Boudicca, quote, "But much more important than just creating the look of a Roman town was creating the idea of one. Out would go the old ways of bartering, tribal obligations, and local fiefdoms. In would come denominational coinage, a capitalist economy, and loyalty to a distant emperor. The key to Romanizing the new provinces, however, was in designating towns as coloniae, a place for retired soldiers who were given or basically just took parcels of land for housing and allotments for subsistence. And this was far more than mere land grabbing or imperial largesse. By establishing a colonia, the authorities knew they were deliberately spreading Roman ideas like a virus throughout the body of Britain. Though the initial invasion may have been violent, the cells would slowly breed and spawn Roman culture throughout the land until the host country was completely overtaken. She really makes it sound like a parasite invading someone's body.
It's a fantastic analogy, though.
Yeah, once the new province had been sufficiently Romanized, there was little, if any, need for continued military action within its lands, freeing up the army to keep expanding ever outwards the frontiers of the empire. So can we pause a minute and just take a look at what she means by the idea of a town?
Yeah, I really want to break this down because this was one of the things that blew my mind when I read it, okay? Here's the final step in Roman colonization. You had to set up a town. But it wasn't just this process of building a town, brick and mortar shops and houses and stuff. It was the psychological idea of creating a town.
What does the idea of a town mean?
So here we go. It's essentially willing a Roman town into existence in a foreign land and forcing the native peoples to accept it, to accept and live by Roman customs, to see this Roman town and everyone in it as part of another kingdom who had their own customs and who were actively forcing those customs onto their neighbors.
Okay, so how did that work in practice?
So here's how it worked. The Romans chose strong locations for their towns that dominated local trade routes, and they brought their own merchants from all over the empire. Not to mention, they were the ones with money and land now, because they'd taken it all and impoverished you and your neighbors. And this means that if you were a British merchant in Roman Britain and you wanted to trade at all, you had to trade like and with the Romans.
Yeah, they were controlling all the trade routes and they had all the money. So you had to deal with them, and you had to deal with them their way.
Exactly. And by dealing with them their way, you were being forced to take their customs like a virus and bring them back to your people. Because it was difficult for you to go back to your people and explain why you made a certain deals with the Romans that they might not see as being satisfactory, because the Romans now had all the cards.
It certainly would set people against each other within native British communities, you know? So gone was the ability to barter and trade. If you had something you wanted to sell, you sold it for cold, hard Roman coins, or you didn't sell it. If you wanted to buy something, you bought it with cold, hard Roman coins, or you went without, which means you had to have something valuable to the Romans, whether it was something to sell, something to trade, whatever, your skills. You had to have something of value to sell to the Romans to get their money. Your own tribal coins and money would be useless in this environment. Your tribal standing as an aristocrat in a Roman town meant nothing. To the Romans, you were all one thing, barbarians, and your worth was all equal and equally low in their eyes. You got with the Roman agenda, or you found yourself unable to trade, unable to interact, and eventually unable to live in your own land. The name that the Romans had for non-Roman citizens living in lands that they conquered, like local people who were not Roman citizens in the land that they conquered, was peregrini, which I believe meant foreigners.
In their own land.
In their own land. Yeah.
So gross.
And who were the brave Romans who were tasked with implementing this final step in the colonizer's handbook? Veterans.
The Roman army was very diverse. Soldiers could come from anywhere in the entire empire, and along with its own military, the Roman army included warriors from client kingdoms and conquered peoples, serving in units led by people from their own tribes or countries, fighting their own native styles, and these were the auxiliaries. Both the legionaries and the auxiliaries needed somewhere to go when they retired, and Rome needed to keep its borders strong and expand their presence in conquered areas. So there was a solution, the colonia. If you enlisted in the Roman army, you were promised land when you retired, but you wouldn't have any say as to where that land was going to be. The Roman army liked to settle its veterans in colonia, or towns built especially for that purpose, in recently conquered territories, usually on the outer fringes of the empire.
Settling veterans on the fringes of the empire, giving them the farmland and peaceful retirement that they'd been promised, allowed Rome to keep their newly ill-gotten territory with minimal force. Veterans were uniquely used to living in unsettled or recently conquered territory, so they were used to the instability, and they were skilled in fighting. Should some kind of aggression by the native peoples break out, well, you had seasoned warriors in your towns. All they had to do was put down their farming tools or whatever else they were doing and protect their new homes at moment's notice. Actually, though, a lot of the time, this was not the empire just giving the veterans farmland and a peaceful retirement. What they'd do is they'd send them to these territories where their colonia was supposed to be, but then the veterans had to essentially take their allotted farmland away from people who were already living there. So they were basically sent to appropriate their own retirement land.
This wasn't a peaceful process, and it wasn't as clear-cut as the Romans would like you to believe.
So in addition to the veterans who lived in these Roman towns, you would have a mixture of tradespeople from various other areas in the Roman Empire, Roman high-ranking dignitaries like governors or procurators and their families and servants and slaves, and you'd have Romanized British people. Some of these would be people from tribes who had sided with the Romans, or maybe those who had been conquered but who were now trying to make lives in a new Roman-controlled area, attempting to trade their goods, skills, or labor to the soldiers in the colonia. The Romans would have had a regular income, so they might have seen this as their only option for making a living now.
Absolutely. I mean, if you were a baker or a butcher or, I don't know, things involving trade of goods and that weren't like necessarily being a farmer on the land, and you needed to sell the stuff you had, even farmers, I suppose, you had to be with the people who had money. But more I'm thinking people who like made imported things.
I mean, yeah, because the veterans got a stipend as well as land. Is that correct?
I believe they had a stipend as well as land.
So they had like regular income, which as we talked about in the Hadrian's Wall episodes, that was not common in the ancient ancient world, especially not, I feel like, in a conquered area where everybody, like local people, would be impoverished now because the Romans took all their shit.
But you also have to remember that Camulodunum in particular was important because it was kind of one of those, like, gateways to mainland Gaul.
And the British traded with Gaul a lot, so that would have been really important, yeah.
And most importantly now, the Romans traded with Gaul, because how are you going to get all those things like olive oil and the good wine and all the other luxuries into Roman Britain if it doesn't go through Gaul? So let's get back to these British towns. Some of the British in Camulodunum would have been slaves, either taken in war or bought after at a slave market in the town, most likely. Many would be women who had been bought by the soldiers as slaves and later forced into marriage with them, because that is a very real thing that happened. And also the children that they had with these soldiers, these like hybrid families, would all be in this town. So that's what the people who made up the city of Camulodunum would have looked like. Retired soldiers, wealthy Romans, and Romano-British, British people who'd been Romanized. And most likely a good amount of enslaved people, or people probably forced into marriage by veterans who wanted a wife and a good life and kids, because it's all awful. It's all fucking awful.
You weren't technically allowed to be married in the Roman army, although a lot of people had common law marriages.
Yeah, so essentially you came there as a single guy in, I guess, your 40s or whatever, 30s, 50s, however old you were when you got out of the Roman army, depending on when you went into the Roman army. And you wanted a wife and you wanted kids and you wanted someone to look after you in your old age. And
so you bought somebody.
You bought somebody because the ancient world is awful and women are property. Anyway, it's important to understand what the city looked like and who the people who lived there were, because their lives, such as they were about to be obliterated by Boudicca's army. And now, let's return to Boudicca. She had survived her flogging. Her people had booted the Romans out of their village, maybe even out of all of their territory, and now she was out for blood. She had tried peace, and now she would have war.
Boudicca put out the call and started gathering allies to lead an anti-Roman resistance. And the first potential allies she turned to were her neighbors, the Trinovantes. They also had a real raging anti-Roman agenda, particularly against the veterans who had settled in Camulodunum, those assholes in particular. Tacitus explains to us chillingly well, quote, "The bitterest animosity was felt against the veterans, who, fresh from their settlement in the colony of Camulodunum, were acting as though they had received a free gift of the entire country. Driving the natives from their homes, ejecting them from their lands, they styled them captives and slaves, and abetted in their fury by the troops, with their similar mode of life and their hopes of equal indulgence. More than this, the temple raised to the deified Claudius continually met the view like the citadel of an eternal tyranny, while the priests chosen for its service were bound under the pretext of religion to pour out their fortunes like water." So here's the thing about what Tacitus is explaining here. He is explaining Roman colonization from the colonizer's own mouth. Tacitus was the son-in-law of Agricola, who was the architect of British subjugation. And at this point, in Boudicca's rebellion, he would have been a young man just starting in his career, and he possibly would have been involved in some capacity with one or both of these uprisings. We don't know for sure, I don't think, but that's a theory.
All of history in general, it's so easy to forget or confuse names and people, particularly Roman history. But the Tacitus-Agricola connection is really, really key here.
So anyway, the Trinovantes were furious because the veterans living in the new colony, ironically called Colonia Claudia Victricensis, or the colony or city of the victory of Claudius, had started pushing out and taking more and more of their land. Like, what is the fine print of getting the peaceful retirement that all these veterans were promised? Like, they were promised a peaceful retirement and some land, but that land wasn't going to be empty when they got there. Like, a lot of the time, they had to drive the previous occupants off of that land, so they have to commit violence to get their retirement territory anyway.
I mean, in theory, they were supposed to only stick to the land that was actually given to them by Rome, right? Rome went into wherever it was, and they made these agreements with where the land was supposed to be, right?
But there still might be somebody on that land that they'd have to kick off.
So in theory, no one was supposed to be there. But the reality of the situation is people were there. And then what happened is that in addition to people being in the land where they got kicked off, a lot of Romans were like, yeah, but you have a bigger plot, or I want this plot over here. So in addition to this land that they'd maybe agreed with the tribes to appropriate, they just took it really. In addition to that, what is galling and infuriating is then the veterans decided, but we want more land. Like, we each could have slightly bigger farms and we each could have more. Who is there to stop us? We'll just take more and more and more. And that is a real thing that happened because, like I said, there was in theory land that was supposed to be for the veterans, but that land always wound up spiraling further and further outward.
Yeah.
So slowly, the Romans took everything around them, and anyone who pushed back was dealt with violently, until everything as far as the eye could see fell under Roman rule, whether it was land that was originally, in quotation marks here, agreed to be a settlement or most likely not, or, as we've talked about before, there's a lot of Roman willful miscommunications that we come across. So what happened here is that the remaining Trinovantes, who used to have the area around Camulodunum as their home, were forced to flee, or they were taken into slavery and subjugated. And to make matters even worse, the Romans forced the Trinovanti nobles, who had status in their own community and some wealth, to work as priests at the temple of the deified Claudius and to actually pay out money for the privilege. They had to worship their oppressor as a god. They had to pay out their fortunes to help build this horrible, gaudy Roman temple. And it was just a really awful fucking scene, man. Not only had the Romans fucked about with taking the land from the Trinovantes, land that was sacred to the god Camulus, now they wanted all the Trinovanti nobles to pay for the privilege of being colonized. Nope. There's a great squid of nope going off into the distance.
Squid of nope. Spraying its ink everywhere and disappearing in the ink cloud.
Of nope.
The ink cloud of nope.
So when Boudicca put out the call for rebellion, the Trinovantes were the first ones to enlist. A lot of people like to say that Boudicca got lucky with her early victories. And I can understand that interpretation as you see it from the ancient sources. But I would say there's another case to be made here. Boudicca, much like Spartacus, who we talked about last season, understood her enemy. She understood who she was up against and just what the Romans would do to her and all those who followed her if she wasn't successful in her rebellion.
She had just survived what would have probably been a flogging or scourging as a precursor to a crucifixion. She'd just watched as her daughters, princesses of their tribe, were carried off and raped, which may have been a precursor to execution. She knew exactly what was at stake, and she knew that no one was safe. The colonia existed to try and force the native British to live by Roman rules, but Boudicca now knew that the idea that the native British could live beside the Romans as allies was a fallacy. Roman allyship was a myth, because at any point in time, the Romans could change the rules, and you and your family could become a target. But she also saw how fragile Rome's hold was on her homeland. All the seasoned legions were off fighting in the west. The people left in her area weren't exactly the cream of the crop, and she knew that. She knew that it was now or never for her people. If she could take on the Romans here, on her home turf, and win, she had a chance of joining up with the other rebelling forces in the west and maybe, finally, getting rid of the Romans for good. So, when she called together the local tribes to go to war, she was preparing for a winner-take-all, take no prisoners, leaving behind only flames and bodies, war.
Scorched earth war. Vercingetorix-style war.
Strike while the iron is hot, because the Romans are busy in the west. They're going to support that rebellion by setting fire to the east. Anyone who found themselves in a Roman city was a colluder. Man, woman, child, enslaved, free, Romano-British, or Roman. Boudicca and her army were not out to make friends. They were not out to take back their land. They were not out to explore the nuance of being British but having to survive in the Roman world and make concessions and use the Roman money and use the Roman language and function in the Roman world. They were not interested in all of the excuses. They were out to slay the oppressors and anyone who had sided with them.
The strategy here, because a lot of times we hear Boudicca had no strategy, let me tell you, the strategy here was scorched earth.
And that's a real strategy, and it makes sense. Vercingetorix used it.
Yeah, and if this war had been successful, it would have been a war of attrition, where literally Boudicca and her army just made it so difficult to hold this British province that they would eventually leave. And that wasn't the worst strategy. We'd seen that happen with Julius Caesar. Boudicca has an utterly epic call to arms speech that was written by Cassius Dio, but there's no way that Boudicca actually said any of the things in the speech. First, these speeches were famously written as apocryphal speeches, written in the future, put into the mouths of people in the past to comment on the present or some bit of history that the biographer, historiographer, whatever you want to call them, wanted to say about that moment. And Dio, as we've said before, was writing about 175 years in the future, and no one kept a transcript of what Boudicca actually said. Because no one was taking notes, no one was writing the shit down, but the speech itself that Dio has given her is such a commentary on everything that Dio wants to get across about Rome at that time and probably in his own time. And I really struggled not to put the entire speech, which is like 4 pages of just bashing so many Caesar and Nero and Claudius. I just wanted it all in because I'm such a nerd.
Jen was sending me snippets of this for a week, and I finally texted back. I was like, Boudicca didn't say all this shit. This is just one Roman throwing shade at another Roman.
I know, and I was like, don't you just want to talk about it in depth on the podcast? Do you want to nerd out with all of our listeners?
That would actually be kind of a fun Patreon episode. We do the whole speech and just talk about it.
Let's do it.
Okay, I'm excited.
Anyway, so here are the highlights of Dio's speech that he gave Boudicca to inspire her tribal allies on the eve of their first battle. Like I said, it's so fucking ridiculous, but here we go. This is just a small snippet. Quote, "Have no fear whatever of the Romans, for they are superior to us neither in numbers nor in bravery. And here is the proof. They have protected themselves with helmets and breastplates and greaves, and yet further provided themselves with palisades and walls and trenches to make sure of suffering no harm by an incursion of their enemies. For they are influenced by their fears when they adopt this kind of fighting, in preference to the plan we follow of rough and ready action. Indeed, we enjoy such a surplus of bravery that we regard our tents as safer than their walls, and our shields as affording greater protection than their whole suits of mail. As a consequence, we, when victorious, capture them, and when overpowered, elude them. And if we ever choose to retreat anywhere, we conceal ourselves in swamps and mountains so inaccessible that we can be neither discovered nor taken. Our opponents, however, can neither pursue anybody by reason of their heavy armor, nor yet flee. And if they ever do slip away from us, they take refuge in certain appointed spots where they shut themselves up as in a trap. But these are not the only respects in which they are vastly inferior to us. There is also the fact that they cannot bear up under hunger, thirst, cold, or heat as we can. They require shade and covering. They require kneaded bread and wine and oil. And if any of these things fails them, they perish. For us, on the other hand, any grass or root serves as bread, the juice of any plant as oil, any water as wine, any tree as a house. Furthermore, this region is familiar to us and is our ally, but to them it is unknown and hostile. As for the rivers, we swim them naked, whereas they do not cross them easily, even with boats. Let us, therefore, go against them, trusting boldly to good fortune. Let us show them that they are hares and foxes, trying to rule over dogs and wolves."
So this is just the highlights of a very long anti-Nero, anti-Caesar, anti-Augustus rant that Dio goes on. We're going to do a Patreon where we give you the whole thing and make an extremely uninformed commentary on it.
Yeah, I'm going to drink wine, Jenny's going to drink wine, and we're just going to throw shade on Dio and history, and it'll be great.
So what I see in this is a lot of Roman stereotypes about quote-unquote barbarian people and how they can survive in cold and heat, and they're really tough and sinewy, and they can survive all these privations, which is actually a stereotype that led the Romans to enslave people like this in larger numbers and put them in places like latifundias and mines, which were the worst places to be enslaved because they had this reputation among the Romans. There was this stereotype of them being physically tough, whether or not they were physically tougher than anyone else in the ancient world or not. So I see that in this.
Absolutely. And that's why I wanted to include this, because remember, Dio is giving us these words. So this is not a speech. It's an apocryphal speech. Boudicca never made it. So as much as it's like saying we're tougher, we're better, we're stronger, we're superior to the Romans in strength and everything else, what it's also saying is like, because of these things, we are less civilized, and the Romans eventually will be able to colonize us and make us have this horrible life once they finally enslave us. But I think it's important to show what the Romans thought of the ancient Britons and how they saw them in addition to all the dark shit.
And also, there's a flip side here. It also shows, if you take some of this at face value, it does give you a little bit of a glimpse in how the native Britons may really have had some advantages over the colonizers, because there was this narrative in ancient Rome that the Romans adapted super quickly to Roman Britain and they were doing really well over there. But according to this speech, the Romans had not been adjusting as well to the British province as maybe some of their sources had led people to believe.
Yeah, and again, that does aggrandize them eventually because they do manage to colonize Britain. But I think it is kind of important to see that in my book, and we're going to talk about this in our next episode, Boudicca gets a lot of shit for not being a strategic person. But there was a strategy, I think, behind what Boudicca was doing. And Dio is kind of on my side here. He's saying we have advantages and there is a way forward to potentially maybe take on the Romans and win.
She's picking out things that they would have been terrified of. The Romans have strong walls, they have better armor, they have all these weapons, they have all these advantages, and she's taking those advantages and turning them into weaknesses to inspire her army. A lot of stuff is happening in this speech.
I mean, that's why these speeches are so important and they come down to us today, and why they're such a fascinating tool we have to understand the people of a different time, even if it is told from the colonizer's point of view.
So after this epic speech, Dio tells us, quote, "When she had finished speaking, she employed a species of divination, letting a hair escape from the fold of her dress, and since it ran on what they considered the auspicious side, the whole multitude shouted with pleasure, and Boudicca, raising her hand toward heaven, said, 'I thank thee, Andraste.'" So, according to Dio, Boudicca released a rabbit. She had a rabbit in her shirt. Or her dress.
She had a boob bunny! She had a bunny in her boobs!
In her cleavage!
I actually think if she was holding it, though, it might have been in her. Like, think about how soothing that, like, skin to skin would be. Like, rabbits can be quite skittish. Like,
I feel bad for the poor rabbit. She just put it cruelly out into the world and made it run. It was probably really scared. It's a big crowd.
No, it was okay. No, here's what I think happened. Like, she had this rabbit, it got used to her heartbeat and everything else. It might have been slightly tame, and then she let it go into the world, and the rabbit did her a solid. And then, one of her friends picked up that rabbit later, like Sertorius's white stag. I bet this is Boudicca's white bunny or something. Or brown bunny. I bet this is Boudicca's brown bunny.
I don't know what color the bunny was, but I do know that it was definitely in her boobs, because that is absolutely attested in the history.
In the history Jen's told us, which is not at all true. It's fine. The dubious history.
The Spartans had shirt foxes, and
the Britons had boob bunnies. I now really want, like, JL to make us a design that's just Boudicca's boob bunny.
Yeah, just, like, massive cleavage with a rabbit. And you know what? I feel like this has been done by Playboy. Oh dear. That's not where I intended to take this. I'm done. Anyway, so according to Dio, Boudicca released her poor little half-tame boob bunny into the cold, cold world in this crowd of loud people who were screaming at it to see where it would run to. And of course it was fucking terrified. It just ran wherever it felt like it could run, but that was considered an auspicious direction. That sent the message that the gods were smiling on this rebellion. So Boudicca also invokes Andraste, a warrior goddess and supposedly the patron goddess of the Iceni. Dio gives Boudicca this moment of divination and association with Andraste for a lot of reasons. We're going to get into the reasons. So, reason number 1. The Romans, the real audience for this speech, because that's who Dio was writing for, the Romans were superstitious, and the idea that Boudicca got a clear sign of victory would have carried a lot of weight with a Roman audience. They would have seen this sign that Boudicca's early victories were a dead certainty. It was foretold by the gods, and that way they didn't have to feel so bad about themselves for doing so bad against Boudicca initially.
But also, most importantly, it would excuse them for doing so little for the people in the areas, because the reality is that we'll come to a little bit later when we talk about what happened in Camulodunum and Londinium. They were severely understaffed, and the Romans made conscientious choices not to send recruits. And that resulted in a lot of human casualties. But if Dio is telling us the rabbit went in the direction of victory for Boudicca, well, it makes sense those generals didn't send any more people. They would have just lost anyway.
Yeah.
Here's the other thing. In this speech, Dio gives Boudicca the divinatory powers of a druidess, perhaps the sleight of hand powers of one too, and or the powers of a priestess of Andraste. And this would have sent the message to Roman readers that Boudicca was more than just a woman. And we talked about this in our last episode, but it was very, very, very important to the Roman audience that Boudicca come down through history as a big, bad, scary other. Because the idea that she was a clever, normal woman who took up arms and sacked 3 Roman cities and wiped out a legion was terrifying. So she had to be more than just a mere woman. She had to be a druidess.
This style of divination, like an animal going in an auspicious direction, strikes me as a lot more Roman than Druidic.
It's so Roman. Everything about it is Roman.
I will pause and say that we don't actually know what Druidic is because we have no record of how the Druids worshipped or what their divination process looked like. But I feel like that this is more like I've seen Romans do this thing with animals behaving in certain ways, and that's kind of a sign. So I think, again, this is very much for a Roman audience. They're saying, oh, this is what a Druidess does. It's not necessarily what a Druidess does.
No, they have no idea. They're just making it up as they go along because the Druids never shared their secrets with them, and the Druids didn't write it down. That was how the Druids worked. But again, the important thing here is that Boudicca is other. And the sign that Dio is showing us that Boudicca's army would have these early victories can be very clearly interpreted by the Roman audience as this was fated to happen. There was nothing we could do.
So that was how Boudicca roused her army to battle, according to Dio. We don't know exactly how big Boudicca's army was. Dio tells us that her army was made up of 120,000 people, but this is clearly a gross exaggeration. We do know that Boudicca's army wasn't just combatants. It was made up of men, women, and children, not just warriors. But 120,000 people is one of those round ancient world numbers that we don't know. It's a little bit too even. Doesn't quite work out.
We talked about this in the Spartacus series we had last season. Whenever you see those big round numbers, someone is lying. Like, it's not real. It's an inflated thing to either make Boudicca's army look so big and so massive that, of course, that's why they were so successful and the Romans weren't.
They build up their enemies to aggrandize themselves. That's like a big feature of how Romans describe their own wars. Anyway, so Boudicca and her army made their way towards Camulodunum. They sacked and burned every town along the way that wasn't allied with them. They were terrifying, but they were not moving that fast. They had a lot of non-combatants. They had an unwieldy baggage train. This was an army you could see coming from a long way off.
You could see it, and also you could hear it. They were not a stealthy, organized army.
No. So the citizens of Camulodunum knew this army was coming, and they had time to prepare. You know it's going to hit you, but it's not going to show up for a few weeks.
I'd be running it anywhere I could get out of town.
Just hit the sauce, Jen. That's all you can do.
I mean, if it would help.
So anyway, moving on. As Boudicca's army approached Camulodunum, a rash of signs and portents broke out that did not bode well for their town. Here's what happened according to Tacitus. Quote, "Meanwhile, for no apparent reason, the Statue of Victory at Camulodunum fell, with its back turned as if in retreat from the enemy. Women, converted into maniacs by excitement, because that's what happens when women get excited.
Boobs out.
Sticks in my hair, I'm gonna rip an animal to pieces.
Oh yeah, once the boobs come out and the sticks go in my hair, you're all in trouble. Full on Maenad.
Anyway, so women, converted into maniacs by excitement, because that's always what happens, cried that destruction was at hand and that alien cries had been heard in the invaders' Senate House. The theater had rung with shrieks, and in the estuary of the Thames had been seen a vision of the ruined colony. Again, that the ocean had appeared blood-red and that the ebbing tide had left behind it what looked to be human corpses, were indications read by the Britons with hope and by the veterans with corresponding alarm.
Tacitus tells us that all signs and portents pointed to shit going down at Camulodunum, and that shit was not going to be good. Again, these details are being told to us after the fact, and the Romans love to big up those signs' importance. But a part of me really does trust Tacitus here. The Romans who survived Boudicca's sacking would definitely have told some wild stories, and it does not surprise me that they would have reported these back to their family and loved ones. Did everything happen exactly the way Tacitus reported? I mean, no, probably not. We'll never know. But we do know that the Romans in Britain had been given a clear warning according to what they told their loved ones and eventually made its way to Tacitus. Their gods were telling them a reckoning is on its way. So, with Boudicca's epic army on its way, the people of Camulodunum had few options. Those with wealth and power most likely fled across to Gaul. Those with ties further into the province might have fled further inland, hoping to take refuge in the city of Londinium or somewhere further west. But those without money and with nowhere else to go would have found themselves with only two options: hope against hope to hold off Boudicca's army and save their city, or throw themselves upon the mercy of Boudicca and her rebels. Neither option was a good one. And those without money would have been people who might have only reluctantly sided with the Romans or been enslaved by the Romans.
So we've talked about siege warfare before. Our very first episode on this podcast is called How to Survive a Siege. And we did a 2-part series on what happens if your city gets sacked in the ancient world. How do you survive? Like, this is a thing people dealt with all the time back then. So cities that were sacked in the ancient world were often razed to the ground by fire and the people inside massacred. Those who weren't immediately massacred were subject to rape and enslavement. You have to feel a certain amount of terror for the people of Camulodunum. They would have known about the approaching army. Those who could flee had probably fled. Those left had nowhere else to go. Many of them were probably British themselves. Some of them were British women who had been bought in slavery and then married Roman veterans or, auxiliary veterans. So these were women who were not there by choice, who were also British women.
And maybe their children.
They're Romano-British children, which I'm sure Boudicca wouldn't have much sympathy for, but they'd have very little choice as to their circumstances. And I will say that we see mention of British wives of these veterans, and I don't know that it necessarily says that they were enslaved and bought, but that is a pattern that we see a lot, so we can only assume that that is what is happening here a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think the important thing here is that we don't know exactly what Camulodunum would have looked like. So we're going off of research we know about Hadrian's Wall, and we're going off what we know at the time. So we know that this is how the cities and colonies would have been set up. So while we can't 100% say it would have been this way, the reality is it probably would have been this way. I can't tell you 100% it would have been this way because, number one, that research doesn't exist. And number two, they're finding new things out every day.
Yeah. Anyway, other people who would have found themselves in Camulodunum staring down the barrel of Boudicca's army would have been people from conquered British tribes, and those who had decided to ally with Rome, possibly reluctantly, people trying to figure out how to live in this newly Roman world, in a place that used to be theirs, but where they no longer felt they belonged. So the people of Camulodunum appealed to their procurator. Their procurator just happened to be the guy who actually had lit the flame of Boudicca's rebellion. That's right. Decianus Catus, Catinus, 10th of his name. And Catus badly misjudged the situation. Shocker. I'm shocked. Oh my God. Look at that. Decianus Catus has misjudged a situation. This is a shock of the century. So Tacitus tells us, quote, "The people of Camulodunum applied for help to the procurator Catus Decianus. Catus sent not more than 200 men without their proper weapons, and this is 200 men under-equipped to face down an army of 120,000. In addition, there was a small body of troops in the town, relying on the protection of the temple, and hampered also by covert adherents of the rebellion who interfered with their plans. These troops neither secured their position by fosse or rampart, so they didn't build any additional defenses, is what Tacitus was saying, nor took steps by removing the women and the aged to leave only able-bodied men in the place. So the people of Camulodunum were as carelessly guarded as if the world was at peace, when they were enveloped by a great barbarian host. All else was pillaged or fired in the first onrush. Only the temple, in which the troops had massed themselves, stood a 2 days' siege and was then carried by storm."
So let's break this down. The poor people of Camulodunum who weren't able to flee applied to the Roman procurator to protect them.
And he was like the worst person possible to apply to for protection.
But you can see what's going on with the people of Camulodunum. They're like, here's the thing, guy. We've paid you taxes. The Romano British were like, we've surrendered land and maybe given up some of our freedom. All of our freedom, maybe. And the retired soldiers were like, hey, wasn't this the protection that we fought and bled for, when we were serving the empire? Weren't we supposed to have peace in our retirement?
Those tribal people would have been like, wasn't the one thing that the Romans promised us protection?
That was the whole racket. That was like the early mafia. You pay us, we give you protection, all your enemies go away. And they're like, but our enemies they're coming. But what? No? So
Boudicca's army's at the gate, and they're like, okay, so is this not a scenario where we're supposed to have that theoretical protection? Is this not it? Like, does this meet the criteria? So the Romano British and the veterans were like united on one side here for once, I guess.
Exactly. Because their procurator, their Hiatus,
10th of his name.
Here's what he actually did. He sent 200 under-equipped troops to defend a city without walls against an army of 120,000. And then Hiatus fled the country. And Tacitus tells us this in a later paragraph, which I've not included, that he took a boat and sailed to Gaul because he knew that the citizens of Camulodunum were no match for Boudicca's army, and he wasn't about to get massacred at the hands of the people he'd oppressed. I mean, no, that sounds like a bad Tuesday. And, this is just further proof that Hiatus is the worst.
As if you need further proof of that.
I mean, look, I just proved my theory, okay? I feel like I have to show my work here.
Is that your graduate level thesis? Hiatus is the worst.
No, the worst is actually Theseus, but Anyway, Boudicca's epic army raged across the countryside, burning, looting, and ravaging everything it touched. The sound of war horns blew. The cries and songs of war wafted on the breeze ahead of the army. The people of Camulodunum were now out of options.
The people of Camulodunum also knew that they were fairly defenseless on a military level. So their city did have some defensive dikes, I guess, that had been built in the Iron Age and pre-Roman times at some point. But this city did not have defensive walls. It was pretty exposed. But there was one building in the new town that might have given some people a chance if they could get to it and take refuge there. That building was quite possibly the most hated one in town, the temple of the deified Claudius. The temple had walls, high, strong walls. It was a new building in good repair. It had a pair of giant, thick, strong doors, and it might have been the most defensible location in the city. It's possible those taking refuge there thought that they could hold it, at least until reinforcements arrived, if they ever did. But I think that once this got started, they thought that reinforcements were coming, right? And I don't know why they would have thought that, because they sent a message to Hiatus, and Hiatus totally let them down. So I guess a different message went out at some point.
Yeah, I think they really believed that this is what I think, but I could be wrong, that reinforcements were coming, that they wouldn't be left high and dry, that all they had to do was hold the city. They were soldiers. They had nowhere else to go, especially if they were auxiliaries. Like, there was nowhere else for them to peace out to.
Some message might have gone up over Hiatus's head at some point, and people had reason to believe that the Roman army was going to come and help these veterans, at least because they're veterans. So anyway, the new Roman town of Camulodunum was perfectly gridded out, with densely populated streets. The Romans had redone this town when they moved in. It had densely populated streets lined with shops that sold Roman luxuries to the Roman veterans, and it had like a regular grid system of streets. When Boudicca's army hit Camulodunum, the precisely laid out, easy-to-navigate streets made it easy for them to roll through the town, efficiently setting buildings and whole neighborhoods on fire. Then, Boudicca's army got to the Temple of Claudius, where many of the townspeople were hiding. I'd love to tell you that the people who took refuge in the hated Temple of Claudius were able to survive. That when Boudicca's army arrived, they flung open the doors of the temple and threw themselves upon the floor at her feet, begging for mercy. I'd love to tell you that Boudicca was a merciful queen, a queen who saw so many women, children, and non-combatants hiding out in a temple and spared their lives.
But history doesn't work that way. And to be honest, Boudicca wasn't in a position to spare anyone. Everyone who had colluded with Rome, everyone who had sided with the oppressor was an enemy in her eyes. This war she was waging could end only one way for her, in total victory or total elimination. Anything else would result in her and her army facing a loss of their homeland and a lifetime of Roman bondage. The only options for Boudicca and her rebels were victory or death.
So when Boudicca's army got to the Temple of Claudius, they tried to break down the doors, but the doors were too strong. So they climbed onto the roof of the temple, peeled back the carefully laid Roman tiles, and rappelled down inside. Then they slaughtered the townspeople and ransacked the temple. They found the giant statue of Claudius, the hated colonizer who had taken their land and imposed Roman rule. They beheaded the statue. And remember, these were a culture of people who believed in taking the heads of their enemies, so they beheaded the statue of Claudius. The head of Claudius' statue was found in 1907 by swimmers in the River Alde. And the River Alde, how far away is it from Camulodunum, Jen?
I think it's something like 60 miles.
Yeah, so they didn't just behead the statue and just chuck it somewhere. Like, somebody carried it there and threw it in the river, right?
Someone carried it somewhere. Do we know that it was there or that it wound up there after Boudicca's armies disbanded, or when the Romans had colonized them, or that it was hidden there, or that there was a sacred grove there at some point in time? It is difficult to figure out exactly how it got there. Like, it could have been that it was with the army and that it was at some point in time buried there or sacrificed in a grove there, or over the nearly 2,000 years rolled down into the river from somewhere else it was being hidden. We just don't know. No one can say definitively that it was brought and chucked into a river.
Okay. Anyway, so it was found in 1907, almost 2,000 years-ish later, by swimmers in the River Alde. The people who found it took it home and put it in their garden as an ornament. Thankfully, years later, it was identified as what's believed to be the severed head of the statue of Claudius from Camulodunum, and it now resides in the British Museum, no doubt haunting those hollowed halls and hanging out with the severed head of Crassus in the Parthian Theatre Company.
In the Parthian Theatre Company, deciding to put on a, production of the Bacchae. Anytime you need a severed head, one or the other will be there.
Yeah. So once they'd sacked the temple and killed everyone inside, possibly, although that's a little bit disputed, but we're assuming, Boudicca's army set the temple on fire. Meanwhile, fires raged throughout the town, all up and down its precisely ordered streets, entombing anyone left alive in ashes. Or did it? So here's where we talk about the bodies at Camulodunum and why there are none. Weird thing about Boudicca and this layer of ashes that got laid down at Camulodunum. There's no bodies found in the Boudicca burn layer, which we're about to talk about.
There's several reasons. Number one, it could be that people saw this slow-moving army and literally noped out.
So there was, theoretically nobody left in the town except for a few people in the Temple of Claudius, theoretically.
Except for the people who couldn't flee, sure. That's a theory. Another theory is that potentially the bodies would have just been left on the ground to rot, and they may have rotted and decomposed faster because there was no one burying them. We don't believe that Boudicca's army would have built a mass grave and dumped all the bodies in it. They would have just kind of left it there to deteriorate into the ground and get picked over by carrion and all kinds of things that you have left over when you sack a city. If there was a mass grave, it hasn't been discovered yet. There's another thing that it could be. We're going to get there in a minute. So Tacitus tells us that the sack and siege of Camulodunum took 2 days. We don't know exactly if this is true, but it sounds legit. We do know that what happened in the city was so extreme that it scarred the landscape of Britain. You can still see a red-pink layer of destruction in the archaeology that dates back to Boudicca's time period, which is the 60s AD. And it's called the Boudicca burn layer, or the Boudicca destruction horizon.
That is so hardcore.
It really is. According to Vanessa Collingridge, this is the story that archaeology tells us about the Boudiccan burn layer. Quote, "The Boudiccan destruction horizon is a layer of burned red earth at a uniform level in the soil that corresponds with the period of around 60 to 61 AD, varying in depth from half a meter or more to just a few centimeters and containing a range of deposits including fragments of pottery, tiles, and other building debris. It provides a fascinating slice in time and a crucial marker for archaeologists. The pinky red horizon is still clearly visible in the basement storeroom of Colchester's George Hotel. Like a poor man's Pompeii, the destruction horizon has preserved some of the more intimate details of everyday life in early Roman Camulodunum, which have allowed archaeologists to reconstruct glimpses of what it must have been like to live in the town around the time of Boudicca's rebellion. The depth and spread of the layer also underlies just how intent on destruction Boudicca's forces really were. It was no mean feat to turn Camulodunum into a raging inferno, as most of the buildings were made of plaster walls and tiled roofs that were not easily combustible, far from their traditional image of being chaotic, undisciplined fighters. The Britons must therefore have made a very deliberate, well-planned, and systematic effort to set the buildings on fire to ensure the maximum amount of destruction.
And those who didn't die in the fires at Camulodunum, who weren't killed in the siege and the violence that ensued, possibly faced a terrible fate. So we're going to get into that fourth reason we didn't find bodies in the ground in the Boudicca destruction horizon. And this is a little bit spurious because it comes to us from Cassius Dio, who just loves to give gory details, but we're going to just tell you what it is. So, according to Cassius Dio, Boudicca and her army engaged in some really dark fucking hardcore metal shit. Quote, "Those who were taken captive by the Britons were subjected to every known form of outrage. The worst and most bestial atrocity committed by their captors was the following. They hung up naked the noblest and most distinguished women, and then cut off their breasts and sewed them to their mouths in order to make the victims appear to be eating them. Afterwards, they impaled the women on sharp skewers run lengthwise through the entire body. All this they did to the accompaniment of sacrifices, banquets, and wanton behavior, not only in all their other sacred places, but particularly in the grove of Andraste. This was their name for victory, and they regarded her with most exceptional reverence." I mean, I don't know, man. This is some real dark shit, and Tacitus doesn't tell us details like this. Dio is not the closest source to the action here. Dio loves a salacious detail. You have to wonder about this stuff. Like, it might have been just crazy rumors. Here's my push and pull with this paragraph, Jen. On the one hand, I would like to believe that Boudicca would never have done such horrible things to women.
I want to believe that.
Right, she and her daughters had just experienced horrors inflicted on them by the Romans, and would she have been so quick to do this to other women? I mean, I'd like to think not. But here's the other thing. Dio specifies that these were high-ranking women from the community who probably wouldn't have been native British women. They might have been Roman women, the wives of commanders who had been brought there from other places in the empire. They probably weren't local if they were high-ranking, is my guess. I don't know that, but it's my guess. I think she, might have felt like she was justified in doing this to Romans as opposed to native British people. I don't necessarily see her extending a lot of mercy to native British people who she saw as colluders with the Romans either. The picture's real muddy here for me. And the other thing is that, I don't think historians 100% agree as to whether the Celts actually did practice human sacrifice, but Celtic cultures had a lot of deviant burials. And we kind of break that down more in our episode about the Celts, which is called Everything Belongs to the Brave. But it's possible, given all those deviant burials, that human sacrifice was a thing that they did, in which case they might have wanted to make sacrifices to Andraste for giving them this glorious victory. Even if they didn't sacrifice every single person in the town, there might have been human sacrifices of captives from the town.
I think this is super important to think about these human sacrifices. If you're to believe that Boudicca and her tribe and everyone else were horrified by the Romans and everything that had happened to them, and they kind of saw this as the end of their world, what wouldn't you give and sacrifice to get rid of the Romans?
And that's kind of what the human sacrifice is for.
Exactly. So in that instance, I'm like, maybe they did have some human sacrifices if they really believed it would help them get rid of the oppressors.
And in oak groves, which is a detail that Druids did things in oak groves.
Yeah, I mean, the eating of the breast is weird to me, but I don't really understand it. Yeah, the breast eating, I get the impaling. It's just the weird sewing their mouths to their boobs so it looks like they're eating. I don't quite get what that is, if there's something we're missing in some translation somewhere.
It's really fucking weird is what it is.
It's so weird. And here's the other thing. Why is Dio giving us these particular details? There's a lot of things to unpack. Look, if you and I can accept that Boudicca and her people are fighting for their homeland and there is nothing and no one they won't sacrifice to get rid of these Romans, to get them out of their country and to have everything back the way that it was before they came, right? To get rid of the Roman plague.
Sure, let's go with that.
We can agree with that. And if that included human sacrifices, you're kind of on their side a little bit, right? I mean, okay, yeah, no, we're definitely on team don't kill other humans, but
we're definitely on the team don't brutalize women.
In general, don't engage in human sacrifices, like all those things. But you can see a justification in their minds there.
Especially if we're going with the idea that human sacrifice was indeed part of Celtic culture. Sure, we can see what might have led them to do that, and we could say, okay, maybe I believe it. I don't love that about this story, but maybe I believe that it happened.
I don't either, and I've got two things to say. That would explain where some of the bodies went, but not all of the bodies, number one. And number two, this is the most important thing. Always remember who's telling you the story. Dio is giving us these details. He does not need to vilify Boudicca and her rebels to this level. This is way too much. Just the total, burning of Camulodunum, everything they did, that's enough to make Romans fear her, right? He's painting this picture of the rebel army that can only serve one purpose for a colonizer, to show how important and right it was that the Romans eventually subjugated them. Because people who behaved like this, well, that was just not civilized, right? It wasn't, Romans wouldn't do this. They didn't do human sacrifices, gladiatorial matches. Of course not, no. Totally civilized. Please note the sarcasm. So part of the reason Dio is showing this to the Roman reader is he's giving the Roman reader this kind of moral equivocal out. Like, it's okay that we subjugated them and that we're gonna kill them all and be in charge, because people like this, they can't rule themselves. Look at the crazy stuff they're getting up to.
Yeah, you could be justified in doing anything at all to people who are willing to behave like this. That's the thought process.
And that is some dark-ass colonial bullshit.
Yeah.
And again, we don't know that the people actually behave this way. We don't exactly know what happened to the bodies. We don't know how many people died at the sacking or siege of Camulodunum, because archaeology hasn't given us those answers yet.
So before we leave you for the week, I want to tell you the story of the reinforcements which the people sheltered in the Temple of Claudius prayed for. I guess there was some message that was sent over the head of Decianus Catus, 10th of his name. Unclear. However, there were supposed to be more reinforcements over and above the paltry 200 men with no armor or whatever that Catus sent. These reinforcements would have been the 9th Legion. This legion was commanded by a man named Petilius Cerealis. Tacitus tells us that Cerealis and his troops met with Boudicca's troops on their way to Camulodunum, or after the sack of the city. This timeline is fuzzy here. And it did not go well for them. The 9th Legion was totally wiped out by Boudicca's army. Tacitus tells us, quote, victorious Britons routed the legion and slaughtered the infantry to a man. Cerealis with the cavalry escaped to the camp and found shelter behind its fortifications.
So, after encountering Boudicca's army, an entire legion was in tatters. Its cavalry was hiding behind the walls of a military camp. You know Boudicca and her rebels got that sweet, sweet eagle. The countryside of Essex was burning, and Camulodunum, the veterans' colony, the capital of Roman Britain, had been scorched off the map. The only hope the Romans had of stopping Boudicca now was to call back Suetonius's forces, who were off fighting the Druid rebellion in Wales. And on the horizon loomed Boudicca's army. They moved slowly and deliberately, with purpose. Everything they touched would be destroyed in fire and blood. This was a cauterizing fire, one that would heal the land of the hated Roman plague. Every Roman they found would be slaughtered, and the fields and hills, valleys and rivers would sing the songs of the old gods. So that's it for this week.
That's it for this week.
On that cheery note.
It's always a cheery note. I feel like we're always saying the same exact thing at the end, which was well, that was dark. See you in 2 weeks.
I mean, why do people listen to us? I wish we were light. No, the Pictish Beast, we were pretty light.
Let's focus on the positive here. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
So in the meantime, you can catch up with us on social. We're at Ancient Hist Fan on Twitter and Ancient History Fangirl on Instagram and Facebook.
And check out our Patreon. So our Patreon is at patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl, where you can get extra episodes, bonus episodes. We hang out with Liv from Myths Baby all the time and do drunken myth retellings, and it's a ball. You should check it out. Come hang out with us.
So if you join our Patreon, essentially you can hear us weekly. We put out 2 Patreon episodes a month in addition to our normal 2 episodes.
You also get those normal 2 episodes ad-free and about a day before they launch in the main feed. So we have some Patreon shout-outs for today, don't we, Jen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, blanket apology to anyone whose name we mispronounce. Kelly Jar.
Kylie.
Chad Keithley.
Marbles Garbanzo.
Liz. Just Liz.
Jamie Borassa.
Emily Searlate Cluck. Apologies if I screwed that up.
Lucy Sarah.
Wolfman II.
Bailey Blessing Pass.
Thank you all so much. We could not do this without you.
Thank you so much. You're the reason the podcast is still going. We're 3 years old. We're a little baby podcast.
Oh my God, 3 years old is a long time.
I know, we're a toddler.
Gross. Anyway, thank you for listening, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much. You're the reason this podcast is still going.
If everyone who listened to this podcast gave just $1 a month, we could both turn this podcast into a full-time job and be certain that we could keep it going throughout the pandemic and keep bringing you more episodes. It would be a win for everyone.
If you're not a member and you're able to donate, go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. Members get ad-free episodes, extra episodes about fascinating topics, and hilarious, mostly drunken conversations we've had with other podcasters and guests.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl and sign up today to join the fun.
This is a woman's decision. As for men, they can live and become slaves. You've burned 3 Roman cities to the ground, yet still it is not enough. 3 Roman cities up in flames, collaborators entombed in ash with the Roman oppressors, 3 beacons you've lit to the tribes, a message of flames and rebirth. You've tried to get their attention, to show them what you've learned the hard way, that there is no peace with Rome. There is no such thing as Roman justice. There is only the point of a sword. And the only way to live with Romans is to kill them all or die in the process. You've sent your messages, you've burned your litany into the earth, and yet still the tribes do not rise up. The collaborators do not shake off their shackles. What will it take for them all to wake up? Beside you, in your tent, the fire burns. Your daughters sleep nearby, heavy with slumber and the weight of all they've endured. You've sent away your generals and chieftains. You've done as much planning as you could. You looked at the ground ahead, at the lay of the land, and seen there is only one way out. That way is through. Assuming you survive the battle tomorrow, what next? You've given your people back their pride and robbed your enemies of the land they took. But if that was enough, if 3 Roman cities was enough to bring back what was lost, to drive the Romans away from your shores and restore this land to the people it belongs to, then the Romans would be gone by now. But it's not enough. To do that, the entire island must rise up along with you. They haven't. Only the Trinovantes and a handful of others have flocked to your banner. The rest of them cower in their cities and behind their strong Roman protectors, even when you've shown them that neither Romans nor walls will protect them. The truth is, you can't drive the Romans out all by yourself. For this to work, you must swell your numbers. You've heard that in Mona rebellion still rages. You've thought about joining your forces to theirs. The journey would be perilous, but you'd do it. Over 200 miles through Roman-controlled territory, moving fast, lighting fires along the way. That would get everyone's attention. But it would be no easy journey, and your supply chain weighs you down. The long line of women and children, non-combatants, and the vulnerable, people who have nowhere else to go. You cannot just abandon them. You stare into the fire. You are so tired. Your daughters dream. They're breathing even and deep. What you don't tell them, any of them, is you'd stop this if you could. You would go back to your lands and sue for peace, even if it cost you your life. But you no longer believe in Roman peace. You've seen what peace is with the Romans. An illusion. A silent war of attrition where every day, every week, every month, and every year, they take more and more from your people. And they do it without swords, without war chariots. They do it with taxes, with roads, with trade. And when that fails, they do it with language. Once your own Brittonic tongue sang across the land. Now, everywhere, there is Latin. In a few short years, your people have lost so much of it given willingly, and still they do not rise up. They do not see there will never be peace until the Romans are gone. You close your eyes and whisper a prayer to Andraste, to guide your army in battle tomorrow, to watch over your warriors, to give them strength for the long road ahead of you, the endless march down the ancient road to liberate your land. Andraste, you whisper, walk with me on the battlefield tomorrow, deliver death to the Romans, set our lands free from this hated Roman plague. I'm Jen McMenemy.
And I'm Jenny Williamson. And this is Ancient History Fangirl.
And we're back! So, we're at the end of our Boudicca arc, and it's gonna get serious.
It has not been serious yet. It's been a light romp, really.
I'm just so excited for next season, where I have been promised that at least one of the episodes I'm doing probably doesn't have anything to do with genocide.
We say that now, that it's going to be a light genocide-free arc, but we're not 100% sure because you never know where these things take you.
So, when we left off last week, Boudicca and her army had sacked the capital of Roman Britain, a town called Camulodunum. And then her army set their sights further inland, on Londinium, another hated Roman town and a major center of Roman commerce. The people of Camulodunum had found out the hard way that Rome's promises of protection weren't enough to save them from Boudicca's rampaging army. When they begged for help, they were given 200 extra soldiers, and their procurator skipped the province. He was a guy called Decianus Catus, the 10th Catus of his name.
10th of his name.
So, needless to say, things did not go well for the people living in Camulodunum.
That was 200 extra soldiers to face, what was it, an army of 120,000 people?
Something like that. I mean, it's very difficult to know. All these ancient world numbers are incredibly fuzzy, but let's say it's 100,000 people.
So those who were able to flee ahead of Boudicca's slow-moving army of doom did. But those who couldn't flee were left to the mercy of Boudicca. And Boudicca and her army had no mercy. They burned Camulodunum to the ground, unleashing a cleansing fire that was seared into the British landscape and can still be found today. It's called the Boudicca Burn Layer. Sometimes they call it the Boudicca Event Horizon, which just fucking kills me. It kills me. And now I'm dead.
I know. When I started to do the research for this, I was like madly texting Jenny at like midnight my time. I tend to do a lot of work between midnight and 2 a.m. I'm very much a night owl. But anyway, I was texting her and I was like, there is a Boudicca burn layer. It's in the archaeology. There is literally a layer burned into the ground of her destruction.
So what that basically means is that everywhere archaeologists dig in this area, at a certain point when they dig down, there's a layer of ash that's a certain distinctive color. I think it's pink or red.
It's a pinky red. I mean, it changes based on the intensity, essentially, of the heat and I guess probably other environmental factors, but it's like a pinky red layer.
Yeah, so you can see it in the soil when you dig down a certain amount everywhere in London, like around Old Londinium area. I mean, a lot of that has been dug up because London's so developed, but you can still find bits of it.
A lot more of it they find in places like Colchester, where Camulodunum was, and across the countryside. But they find it all over, and it's one of those markers that archaeologists use to actually, like, date history.
And a lot of it isn't this straightforward. Like, having done a lot of this research, I've found that archaeologists today, at least, are really reluctant to assign when it looks like something has been burned in the archaeological record. They're really reluctant to connect that to battles that you find in the historical record because a lot of that has been done kind of erroneously. So Archaeologists are really conservative about doing that today, but with this particular layer, there's absolutely no ambiguity. Like, you can't say, oh, it must have been just somebody's house burned down or an accidental fire, or maybe it wasn't from this time, or, we're misconstruing things somehow. Like, there's no way to misconstrue this. It's very obvious.
But that being said, this layer, this burn layer, does not tell us exactly where battles were fought. It tells us where cities were. But as we're going to talk about, archaeologists don't exactly know where Boudicca's battles were fought.
Right. Okay, so we were just talking about how Boudicca's army burned Camalodunum to the ground, leaving the burn layer. And those citizens of Camalodunum who survived the fire were put to death. Maybe it's a little bit unclear. Then, or maybe beforehand, the timeline is a little fuzzy, Boudicca's army met up with a whole legion sent to reinforce Camalodunum and wipe them out. So all of this went down in the east of the country. And that's what we just covered in the previous episode. But afterward, Boudicca and her army turned their eyes westward. Boudicca's army, according to Cassius Dio, had now grown to an unwieldy 230,000 people, including both warriors and their families. This was a full-on tribal affair with an epic baggage train. It was a slow-moving tsunami.
Up until now, Boudicca's army had gotten lucky, you could say. The Roman commanders it had met had been largely incompetent, and they hadn't really met with much resistance. The bulk of the experienced Roman forces were in the west of the United Kingdom, dealing with the rebellion of the Druids in Anglesey, Wales, which we have an entire episode on. It's called The Druids' Last Stand. But now, Boudicca and her army were proving to be an even bigger threat to the Roman colonial machine than the uprising in Wales. Her army was like a tide, quickly overwhelming all the defenses it met. After Camalodunum, and after Boudicca's army wiped out an entire legion sent to defend Camalodunum, the Romans decided it was time to deal with the warrior queen before the entire province devolved into outright rebellion.
So this is where Suetonius Paulinus comes into the story.
He just swaggers into the story like a swaggering...
Jen really wants me to say that Paulinus was like a honey badger. So here you go, kids. Paulinus was like a honey badger. He gave no fucks. I'm really dating myself with this honey badger thing, but...
There's no gun to your head.
So Paulinus was the governor of Britain, and he had quickly become seasoned in putting down rebellions. At the moment, he was off in Wales putting down the Druid uprising. And when he heard about the fall of Camalodunum and the failure of the legion sent out to oppose Boudicca's army to contain the rebel forces, he realized he could no longer take the stability of the East for granted. There wasn't a moment to spare. If Paulinus wanted to keep the British province from falling into chaos and keep himself from attracting the ire of the notoriously hair-trigger Emperor Nero Neckbeard, he had to get this situation under control fast. So, Paulinus took a skeleton crew of cavalry and rushed from Wales all the way back to Londinium, intending to reach the city before Boudicca's slow-moving army and assess the situation.
At this point, Londinium wasn't a major military town. Quite the opposite. It wasn't the capital of Roman Britain. It wasn't a home to a military fort like Camalodunum, but it was still incredibly significant to the Roman occupation of Britain. Londinium, located right on the Thames, was a trade hub and an important point for receiving critical supplies. It was vital to the Romans as they moved their supply chains across Britain to keep their armies fed. As Vanessa Collingridge explains in her book Boudicca, Londinium was a symbol of everything Roman and hated by Boudicca and her army. Quote, unlike Camalodunum, Londinium was purely a trading town. It had no major fort, no colony of veterans, no real military status at all, though it does seem to have already positioned itself as a center of administration, as the procurator Catus Decianus appears to have based himself there, albeit unofficially, before his rapid departure to Gaul. It was also from here that Decianus was seemingly able to drum up the 200 poorly armed troops to send to Camalodunum's aid. But despite its lack of imperial patronage, Londinium was truly and undoubtedly a Roman creation, and that meant it had immense symbolism as a target.
So Londinium was a cosmopolitan town and a symbol of everything Boudicca and her people had come to despise. Sacking Londinium was just as important to Boudicca as sacking Camalodunum. This was a symbol of the colonial oppressor, and it had to go. There were no two ways about it. In order for Boudicca and her army to take back their country, Londinium had to fall. Paulinus threw together his cavalry, left the smoking battlefield of Anglesey, galloped at breakneck speed the 281 miles from Anglesey to Londinium. I assume he was moving super fast. I don't know what road he took. It's a little bit of a mystery.
Boats.
I think he took Watling Street, actually. It did go that far, and it was an old road that the Romans had paved some of, and it was pre-existing, and if they hadn't gotten around to building other roads back then, that one was definitely available and there. So I think it's possible. Do I know that for sure? Absolutely not.
No, I mean, that's one of the things. They haven't actually been able to retrace with any, conclusive evidence what route he would have taken to get back. I kind of love the idea that maybe he, used the rivers to get back down to the Thames. I don't know.
He would have to take the sea, and that is a lot less dependable and more dangerous.
Yeah, maybe faster. I don't know.
I guess if the winds are right and you don't hit a storm and, the currents are okay and your boats don't get battered against the rocks, because the tides around the island of Britain were extremely scary and undependable, and the largest tides anyone had ever seen in the Mediterranean world.
This is all true. I'm still going with boats.
Jen is going with her completely spurious theory in the face of all evidence. But mine is also equally unfounded.
Does this surprise anyone? Team Loch Ness Monster? No.
She's always going to be on Team Loch Ness Monster. There's nothing you could do about it.
Always.
So anyway, how Paulinus got back to Londinium and how long it took is up for debate, as we don't know which route he took, although, as you can see, Jen and I both have our extremely strong, extremely unfounded fictional theories. But Paulinus most likely took a tiny force of cavalry that could move fast because it was tiny, and raced back east as quickly as possible. He wasn't worried about meeting up with any opposing forces because everyone in the west had been subdued, or they were allied tribes like Cartimagua's people, at least that's what he's assuming, and all the other rebelling tribes were far off in the southwest, in Exeter and Cornwall. In other words, any native Britons he met were likely to be pro-Roman, he thought. And this was important. Paulinus hadn't quite finished his subjugation of the Druids in Wales. The war was still in its closing days, and most of his soldiers were tied up fighting that war. Paulinus couldn't just call all his soldiers to the east of the country right away to respond to this Boudicca situation. Not yet, not unless the situation really was that dire and there were no other options.
And especially not if calling over those soldiers would mean losing wars in both west and east. Paulinus had to be very sure of his next move, because one wrong move and the entire colony could have come crashing down around his head. And then he would likely lose his head when Nero found out. And the ancient sources tell us that at this point in time, Nero was very close to just saying goodbye to the whole occupation because of all the stuff that was going on here. Paulinus needed to see the situation on the ground in the east of Britain. He had to assess what had gone down in Camulodunum and figure out what they were facing, and then meet with the people of Londinium and determine what the next steps were for their future. Londinium was important to the Roman Empire for trade, supplies, and, as we've mentioned, as a symbol. But it wasn't an easy town to hold. It wasn't defended with any earthworks. The famous Roman wall that you can still see pieces of in modern London wasn't built yet. It wouldn't be built until 200 AD, roughly 140 years later.
They just took a long time to build a wall after Boudicca. They just didn't think it was important, I guess.
Yeah, it's like they really didn't learn their lesson.
So in Boudicca's time, Londinium was a fairly new town. While it's difficult to say exactly when it was founded, the earliest archaeological evidence we have dates from around 47 to 50 AD, only about a decade after the beginning of Claudius's invasion. By Boudicca's time, the town was only about 10 years old, a combination of Roman buildings and Celtic roundhouses built at the narrowest point in the Thames, an ideal place to build a Roman bridge. The town was very much a mixture of native British buildings and roundhouses, as well as new gridded roads filled with Roman shops selling things like blown glass, olives, and wine. Archaeology suggests that there was a distinct gridded Roman area that was separate and an area of town that was more haphazardly laid out and more Celtic. Sadly, neither the Roman nor the British part of town included defensive works. There was no moat. There was no earthen ramparts or ditches or walls, and there was no time to create these defenses. Boudicca's army was on their way, and the nearest Roman military town, Camulodunum, had fallen. Any reinforcements Paulinus might have been able to gather from there were gone. To defend the town, he'd have to call back his entire force from Anglesey, and they'd need to build out all these defenses that the city didn't have, which required time. They didn't have time for that. Boudicca's army might be slow-moving, but it wasn't that slow-moving. So Paulinus took one look at the town and made a call. It couldn't be defended. He was going to abandon it to Boudicca.
Paulinus told the people of Londinium that he couldn't protect them. He advised that the inhabitants flee to friendly tribal communities and go as far west as possible before Boudicca and her army arrived. And with that advice, Paulinus noped right out of Londinium. Instead of defending the town, he opted to find a suitable place to meet Boudicca's army in the field and destroy them. But to do that, he needed more time, and most importantly, a different, more defensible location.
Tacitus tells us about the gamble Paulinus made. Quote, Paulinus, with remarkable firmness, marched straight through the midst of the enemy upon London, which, though not distinguished by the title of colony, was nonetheless a busy center, chiefly through its crowd of merchants and stores. Once there, he felt some doubt whether to choose it as a base of operations, but on considering the fewness of his troops and the sufficiently severe lesson which had been read to the rashness of Petilius, and Petilius was the guy who had led that legion that Boudicca had wiped out, he determined to save the country as a whole at the cost of one town. The laments and tears of the inhabitants as they implored his protection found him inflexible. He gave the signal for departure and embodied in the column those capable of accompanying the march, all who had been detained by the disabilities of sex, by the lassitude of age, or by local attachment, fell into the hands of the enemy. Okay, so I have some thoughts on this. Tacitus tells us that Paulinus wanted to win the war at the cost of one city, and to do that, he had to leave Londinium to its fate. The people who were able to follow him followed. Maybe he escorted them to safer harbors in the west. Maybe they just followed the Roman soldiers, hoping for their protection. I have no idea. But those who weren't able to follow, those who couldn't flee or take refuge with friendly tribes, and those who were too attached to the city to leave were left to Boudicca's mercy. Notice how he says the disabilities of sex, as if you're a woman, that's just a disability.
The disabilities of sex here might also mean pregnant women who were less able to travel, or women who were nursing or had small children. Like, that might also be a disability of sex, which I'm not saying is okay. I'm just saying when you think about it, that might also be what he's saying.
So, those who couldn't leave, for whatever reason, were left to Boudicca's mercy. And this mercy wasn't likely to be very merciful. Boudicca and her army were out there right now, burning to the ground any city that was Roman-aligned, sparing no British people who had chosen to live with the Romans. They raided, pillaged, and murdered anyone they came across, and they were not asking questions about the Romano-Britons' nuanced and complicated reasons for aligning themselves with the Romans. They did not care.
You were with them, or you were against them.
If you're going to castigate Boudicca over this is not an unusual tactic. In the ancient world, we also saw Vercingetorix doing the same thing.
I mean, we saw Spartacus doing this. The thing is, when you have an army that you've raised very quickly and you have to sort of get them to work together, you have to have one common enemy, and really the common enemy here is the Romans and anyone who's aligned themselves with the Romans. There is no room for nuance.
Yeah, and the other factor here is that if the goal is to get other people to rise up and join you, you have to make it look dangerous not to do that. And that was, a good strategy, not a good strategy, because, it sucks for the people on the pointy end of the strategy, but it might be an effective strategy if the Romans really are not protecting their British Roman-aligned people, which they're not. If the Romans aren't offering them that protection, they might make the tactical decision to align with Boudicca for their own protection.
Absolutely. And we know in these particular towns, because they were so Roman-aligned, they were not going to come out and be like, we surrender the town to you, Boudicca! That was not going to happen for these people. But there were other towns around there that maybe could join with Boudicca's forces as Jenny said, if the consequences for not joining her forces were great enough.
That's right. And that's the other thing, is that each town she burned would send a message to other towns.
I mean, we saw Julius Caesar do this in his subjugation of Gaul.
Both sides were doing it in Gaul, which meant it was really, really hard to be just a normal person in Gaul during that time.
Yeah.
So Cassius Dio calls what happened at Londinium indescribable slaughter. But some people did have the chance to flee ahead of Boudicca's advancing army, and it's likely that they did. As at Camulodunum, we haven't found mass burials dating from around this time, and I don't think that there's a lot of bodies or bones found in the burn layer. So it's hard to say exactly how many people died.
But it's likely Londinium was sacked and razed to the ground.
I mean, I think it's 100% certain.
Yeah, exactly. Just as with Camulodunum, there's a Boudicca burn layer in the ruins of old Londinium, a Boudicca of Bent Horizon laid down in ash, scorched into the earth. It's harder to find and trace in London today because the city has been so built up since then. But it's still there. telling its story of fire and rage and destruction at the city's very foundations to anyone who will listen. After the sack of Londinium, Boudicca and her army turned their attention to a place called Verulamium. Verulamium was north of Londinium, around modern St. Albans. And the Trinovantes, Boudicca's major allies, had a particular reason to target this town.
Verulamium was a wealthy Cativolani town that was allied with Rome. It had seen its wealth increase under the rulership of King Cunobalin of the Cativolani.
So one of the interesting things that I found out is that when you see like that con, like C-U-N, con, or whatever it is.
Cune?
Cune, probably. Yeah, like that actually means hound.
In the Old Brittonic language?
In the Old Brittonic language, yeah. Because that's where like Cuchulainn gets it. It comes from there. It's like the Hound of Ulster. It's that C-U-N generally means hound. And like hounds and wolves were really like sacred animals in the Old Brittonic culture. As well as, do you remember in the last episode we talked about hares? Hares were really fascinating in the Old Brittonic culture as well, because hares, you know, you kind of think of them as like these creatures that are like frightened and timid, but actually like hares are really associated with the moon. And hares in the springtime when they're mating, they do this thing called boxing where they like literally just get up on their hind legs and box each other.
They do?
They do. It's incredible. I'll find a picture for the show notes. And so like the ancient Britons observed this and they were really fascinated by the hares boxing. And it was kind of just like this interesting other side to the creature.
Was the hare kind of a fierce animal to the ancient Britons as well?
Somewhat, yeah. It could be fierce. Because of that. It was like a interesting kind of unsuspecting mythical animal. They were these animals that like a lot of times in our modern gaze we see as timid, but they had this unexpected fierceness, this real defense of their territory and their land and, you know, their people. And I think it's really interesting to look at them through that light of how the hares would box, particularly during mating season in the spring. Yeah, they were really fierce little bunnies. Actually, hares are bigger than bunnies, but they were really fierce.
I think hares and bunnies are technically not the same thing.
They're not the same thing at all.
Anyway, so King Cunobalin, the Hound, had sided with the Romans, turns out. And in the opinion of Boudicca and her followers, that dude was dead to her. He had betrayed the native Briton. She doesn't care if he has Hound in his name and that's a sacred, faithful animal. She doesn't give a fuck. That dude is toast. At this point in time, King Cunobalin was actually dead, so never mind. But his legacy lived on, and as we've said before, the Trinovantes and the Cativolani were mortal enemies ever since the Cativolani stole the town of Camulodunum right out from under the Trinovantes. That was their ancestral town. They were not happy. This was an epic feud, and the chance to sack this town, Verulamium, was one that could not be passed up. Honor was at stake.
Honor was at stake.
Thank you, Cuchulainn.
Always happy to lend a hand when we need to talk about honor.
Anytime it comes up.
You'll just pop in and tell us honor was at stake. It's great.
It's not Irish history, so it's not 100% his wheelhouse, but, you know. Verulamium wasn't a town like Camulodunum or Londinium. It was different. Vanessa Collingridge tells us about the history of Verulamium, and it is this history that made it so hated to Boudicca and her army. Quote, perhaps because they were already such a progressive and relatively wealthy people, after Claudius's invasion of AD 43, the Cativolani population of Iron Age Verulamium, the original British name, rapidly took up new Roman styles and ideas, and soon they were calling the settlement by the Romanized name of Verulamium. Without any real imperial assistance, they now shook off their agricultural mantle and started building an unashamedly Romano-British town, the third largest in the province. The Romans were so impressed by the attitude and achievements of the population that they not only routed one of their most important roads, later called Watling Street, through Verulamium, the town also won the Roman privilege of being classed as a municipium, just one step down from a colonia like Camulodunum. As the only site awarded this honor, the impact was enormous. It meant that the local magistrates and their families could effectively become Roman citizens with all the privileges that citizenship afforded. These people of Verulamium, they were Cativolani. And the interesting thing about the Cativolani is that they were the original people who spearheaded the resistance to the Roman invasion way back when it started. They were the people that Caratacus led. So what this tells me is that pretty soon after they lost that battle at the Thames and Caratacus had to flee, they must have turned right around and allied with the Romans like immediately after that, and then got to work oppressing themselves, basically.
Like, that's essentially what this is saying, yeah.
Right! Like, all of a sudden, they were not rebelling against the Romans anymore. Oh no, they were the Roman golden children.
I think the reality is they kind of had to be if they wanted to, like, keep the rest of their tribal lands and from being put into slavery and sold off. Like, when you rebel against Rome, which we'll see the effects of at the end of this episode, when you rebel against Rome, the retribution is swift and it is brutal. So you have no choice but to get with the Roman program. And if you don't, then what's left of your people will be taken off the face of the earth.
Yeah, so the Cativolani and Verulamium were basically just acting out of self-preservation here. I mean, I don't think it was just that, as it's characterized in the preceding paragraph, like, I don't think it was just that they were, quote-unquote, like, progressive. They were trying to save their own lives.
They were trying to save their people. And I mean, I think as things moved on, obviously, they enjoyed the trappings of a nice life in a Romanized town would give you. I mean, the Romans had a lot of order. They brought a lot of cool things into Britain that weren't there before. But
aqueducts, wine, olive oil.
But there's always a cost. When you make a deal with the devil, there's always a cost.
Hot running water. I mean, baths.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. It's tough. Like,
I mean, I'm not siding with the oppressor here. Oh, shit.
I'm not either. And I'm not saying that, like, it's worth giving up away your culture or your heritage. But, I mean,
baths, though.
Do you like a bath? I know.
And wine. Baths and wine. Am I that cheap?
Fuck yeah, you are.
I think I'm not cheap. Oh, man. You learn so many disturbing things about yourself when you start a podcast.
Yeah, you learn what a horrible human being you are.
The past 3 years have only taught me how horrible I am, and it's just getting worse. So anyway, Verulamium, once they were, the Cativolani were the famous ringleaders of the resistance against the Romans, and now they were the Roman golden children, with their British community leaders being showered with awards and wealth and Roman citizenship and privileges. It was a Romano-British town filled with collaborators, one of the worst symbols of Roman colonization. It was also the tribal seat of the sworn enemies of the Trinovantes, and the Cativolani had made a lot of money off their alliance with the Romans. So according to Boudicca's army, they had to go.
As soon as they realized Boudicca's army was now headed towards them, the people of Verulamium knew that this was not a battle they could win. Honor might have been at stake, tribal feuds might have run deep, but Boudicca's army was just too big. And they'd seen how this went down at Londinium and Camulodunum. The Romans had abandoned both. There was no way they were going to protect Verulamium, golden child status or not. So the people of Verulamium gathered up their belongings and got the hell out of Dodge. But that didn't save them. Tacitus tells us what happened to the people of Verulamium, and it was grim. Quote, "The natives, or Boudicca's army, with their delight in plunder and their distaste for exertion, left the forts and garrison posts on one side, and made for the point which offered the richest material for the pillager and was unsafe for a defending force. It is established that close upon 70,000 Roman citizens and allies fell in the places mentioned, for the enemy neither took captive nor sold into captivity. There was none of the other commerce of war. He was hasty with slaughter and with the gibbet, arson and the cross, as though his day of reckoning must come, but only after he had snatched his revenge in the interval."
Okay, can we pause for a second?
Can we just pause before we even break this down and just stop? I just want to pull out his distaste for exertion and just start there.
Yeah, with their delight in plunder and their distaste for exertion. Because, I'm sorry, but plundering does take a certain amount of exertion. Like, 90% of plunder is showing up.
Yeah, exactly. You can't plunder without breaking a sweat. Like, if you can, I feel like you are living the dream? I'm not sure. Is that the dream?
Are you really? Do you want to rein that back just a tad?
You're living the nightmare? I don't know.
Listen, bare minimum, you have to get off your couch if you want to participate in the plunder.
Yeah, there's absolutely no way you can plunder without breaking a sweat, without exerting yourself.
You have to get there first.
Yeah, you're not going to get any of the good plunder if you're like the last one off the couch.
Early bird gets the worm, damn it.
If you're like, oh man, I couldn't get into my sneakers this morning, I get no plunder. Whoops.
The only thing you have to wear to the plunder is you just show up naked wearing only your torque and you'll fit right in.
Maybe, depending on where you're plundering. I mean, if you're plundering somewhere real cold.
I guess that would be suboptimal.
Situation's not ideal.
I showed up to Siberian plunder and I'm in my Celtic torque outfit, which is basically no clothes except my torque.
But it's a very cool torque.
If only my brooch hadn't fallen off and all my clothes with it.
I'm not even sure where I was going with this. Where was I going with this? I mean, essentially, what makes me a little ragey about this is it paints Boudicca's army as being very lazy. Like, they want to have their plunder, but they don't want to work at plundering. Like, number one, I'm not an approver of plundering or pillaging or any of those things.
We don't approve of plunder here on this podcast. We do have to say that every so often.
Because sometimes it might sound like we are approving, but we're not.
We do not approve. We frown on plunder. Frown aggressively on it.
Or we would if it wouldn't give us frown lines. So instead...
That's true. It would give us frown lines, so actually what we do is we maintain a very smooth face of disapproval.
Exactly. We've hit that point in our 30s.
That's absolutely true.
Okay, so let's break down the rest of what we've read here. When Boudicca's army reached Verulamium, they ignored the well-defended forts and garrison posts and made straight for the wealthy, relatively undefended areas of the city. They slaughtered anyone who hadn't fled or anyone they met on the road who was too slow in fleeing, so essentially me.
Or me.
Us. Yeah, we're just be like, maybe we'll just see what the army looks. Oh, fuck.
Wrong move.
Bad call. So they took no prisoners. They sold no one into slavery. They just immediately killed anyone they came across. And at this point, Tacitus is telling us that close to 70,000 people have been killed by Boudicca's army. But as we discussed last week, archaeology has yet to find these bodies. There is a myriad of reasons why that could be, which we talked about last week. But I do think 70,000 is probably grossly inflated. The town was razed to the ground, it was burnt down, and it suffered the same fate as Camalodunum and Londinium.
You notice how he mentions the cross, like Boudicca's army was crucifying people? That's more of a Roman punishment, right?
Well, it's very tricky. I'm of two minds here. Yeah, crucifixion would have been a Roman punishment. And remember in our first episode when we talked about Boudicca, and we talked about how she was beaten so badly, maybe even scourged, which was a precursor to crucifixion. So it's possible that if Boudicca may have crucified people as a way to kind of give a fuck you to the Romans.
I could see that. That's possible.
Possible, but that is not a normal way in which Britannic people would have killed someone. The cross is very much about Roman punishment.
Right, it's more the impaling and the boob eating.
I don't think they were doing the boob eating. Definitely impaling, but not boob eating.
No, we draw a line at boob eating.
Which we talked about in our last episode. But yeah, if she was doing that, that was definitely a statement to the Romans and to anyone who had collaborated with the Romans.
So that's what Tacitus tells us. But here is an interesting counter. Vanessa Collingridge tells us, quote, "The most striking difference between the remains from Verulamium and the other sacked towns is that here not a single hoard of coins has been found, nor has any grain been discovered. This can only point to one thing, that the population had time to make a thorough evacuation of the town and left nothing of real value to the advancing rebels. If nothing else, that would have left the Cativolani with some small sense of satisfaction over their old rivals." So, what does this mean? Possibly that most of the Cativolani had a chance to escape with their wealth and lives, which would have been a blow to Boudicca's army. I mean, the theory is that everybody else did too, but maybe they didn't. We don't know. But if everybody managed to get out of Verulamium alive and also with their wealth, that would have been kind of a morale problem for Boudicca's army, because sacking Verulamium was a matter of pride. If Boudicca's army turned up and found nothing there of value and no one there to slaughter, I mean, where's the party? We were promised a party.
We were promised a party and we're not getting a party, and this is deeply unfortunate.
We exerted ourselves expecting some plunder at the end of it. We're bummed and we're blaming Boudicca. I mean, it could have meant some real problems for her. We don't know much about the makeup of Boudicca's army. We know that it was made up of many different tribes with their own leaders who would have been difficult to unite and control. I mean, we've seen other tribal leaders like Vercingetorix in this situation, and it's like herding cats. Tribes who formed Boudicca's war council, and we don't have an inside view of what was going on in Boudicca's war council, or how much dissent she was dealing with. However, much like Spartacus's army, Vercingetorix's army, Pompey's army, any of these guys, it's possible that there was infighting and dissent. And like Spartacus's army and Vercingetorix's army, many of these other, rebel armies that we have studied, this force had been put together very quickly. These weren't battle-hardened warriors. So Boudicca's army might have had some experienced warriors, but the bulk of her forces would have been made up of those who weren't familiar with taking on the might of a disciplined and organized Roman legion. Her army was made up of the losers in those battles. So far, Boudicca's forces had gotten lucky and been able to quickly overwhelm and destroy the small resistance that Rome had put up. But that was all about to change.
Because while Boudicca's army had been sacking Verulamium, Paulinus had been regrouping. He'd been plotting where to lure Boudicca's forces into their final battle. Vanessa Collingridge explains, quote, "Few details are known of the movements of both armies between the sacking of Verulamium and the final battle. Even less is known about the location of where they met. Arguments about the actual site abound, from Surrey to Birmingham to Chowchester. But what is almost certain is that Paulinus would have tried to keep as many details as possible on his terms, not Boudicca's. And in many ways, he still had some advantages on his side. He would have known that her numbers totally outstripped his own, but her army was untrained, so he had to use skill to outwit the greater army. He would also have realized that his strength lay in forcing the British into a pitched battle that was fought at a time and in a place and manner that he could control. He might also have guessed that his local knowledge could well have been better than hers, for the Iceni had generally stayed within their tribal lands over in the Far East. He also had the benefit of having spent at least 3 seasons fighting in the hilly areas of western Britannia, so his men not only had the experience, he knew how to pick an advantageous site for battle. So, as Boudicca and her army moved west, the landscape changed. No longer was this the familiar fields and hills and swampy marshy areas of East England. Now, her forces were out of their territory and comfort zone. They did not know this terrain as well as their ancestral land. And for the first time, Boudicca and her massive army were at a real disadvantage. While they could and did, I'm sure, send out scouts to find out more about the lay of the land, they also knew that they were heading into Roman-controlled territory.
The reality was that Boudicca had a real chance of turning this small local uprising into a major conflagration that kicked the Romans out of Britain for good, but only if they could gather more allies. Maybe Boudicca hoped to reach the Roman allied tribes of Cardamondua or Cogadumnus and turn them to their side. It's doubtful, as Boudicca's army weren't fans of Roman collaborators. I think that's unlikely.
Totally, but you never know. We don't know what Boudicca was thinking because nobody wrote it down.
Right. But if Boudicca had been successful in turning one of these Roman allied British tribes to her cause, the final battle would have gone very differently. Or perhaps Boudicca's plan had been to make connections with the Druid uprising to the west and the freedom fighters in Wales, still battling Roman forces. But to get to them, Boudicca's army would have had to move fast through unfamiliar Roman-controlled territory, about 280 miles or so of Roman-controlled territory. If Boudicca's army was faster moving and more experienced, maybe they could have pulled it off. But they weren't. The pace of Boudicca's army and her epic baggage train, made up of women, children, and non-combatants, would prove to be her downfall.
Paulinus ultimately got to choose the battlefield for the final showdown along an ancient road called Watling Street. Watling Street was originally a broad, grassy lane that had been used for centuries by pre-Roman Britons. It led all the way from Richborough, near Kent, on the English Channel, down to a naturally shallow crossing place on the Thames near a place called Thorney Island. From there, it shot up north all the way to Hadrian's Wall and beyond, to northern Scotland, Pictish territory. An offshoot veered west to northern Wales. And I think this started its life as an ancient droving path, where they were droving cattle and stuff.
Really? I kind of thought it was an ancient Neolithic trade route.
I feel like I read somewhere it was a droving, but I'm not 100% sure.
That would explain why it was so wide.
When the Romans came, they paved parts of Watling Street and built a number of important ports along the English Channel section of its route. They built Londinium at the narrowest section of the Thames, where Watling Street crossed the river. From Londinium, Watling Street traveled north toward Verulamium.
They actually took this road that was like an Iron Age ancient route, the Romans did, and rerouted it through Verulamium because it was that important of a road.
Well, but also that's how important Verulamium was. That's how important it was to their trade. That's how important an ally they were. And that's also why they pissed off Boudicca and the Trinovanti so much.
Yeah.
So in Boudicca's time, the section of road connecting Londinium to Verulamium had been widened by the Romans and paved with gravel. Historians aren't sure exactly where Boudicca's army met with Paulinus, but it was somewhere along this road. The Battle of Watling Street would prove to be the last great uprising of the British tribes.
Tacitus explains how Paulinus chose his battlefield. Quote, Paulinus had already the 14th Legion, with a detachment of the 20th and auxiliaries from the nearest stations, altogether some 10,000 armed men, when he prepared to abandon delay and contest a pitched battle. He chose a position approached by a narrow defile and secured in the rear by a wood, first satisfying himself that there was no trace of an enemy except in his front, and that the plain there was devoid of cover and allowed no suspicion of an ambuscade, which I think is an ambush. The legionaries were posted in serried ranks, the light-armed troops on either side, and the cavalry massed on the extreme wings. Okay, so let's pause for a second and take a closer look at this. You know I love parsing out these ancient battles.
Jenny loves her military history. Military history is like my least favorite thing. I don't know why I chose to cover like Spartacus's revolution and Boudicca's revolution when I don't like battles, but I am so grateful that I have Jenny here to help make sure that we get the most out of every battle, and she's given me a new love and appreciation for battles.
I hope I've taught you to love them a little bit, because they're awfully fun.
You have.
So Paulinus decided that the best way to effectively face Boudicca's army was in this narrow, sort of a chasm with a wood at the rear. So this would mean that Boudicca's superior numbers would basically have to march into a tunnel. What he's basically doing is removing the advantage of numbers that Boudicca has. He's making them march into this narrow choke point where Boudicca's warriors, who were less experienced and less well-armed, would have to face the more experienced Roman troops more one-on-one. And this is where the Romans could use their more highly trained legionaries to pick off the warriors. The position was perfect for a number of reasons. It wouldn't allow Boudicca's army to get around and attack Paulinus' forces from behind because there's that wood. She couldn't use her superior numbers against him because it forced all her army into this narrow choke point. And it also limited the space that each individual warrior had to fight, which naturally favored the Romans in the way that they were armed. The Romans were really well armed and well trained for fighting at close quarters, and Boudicca's army, they were like Celtic warrior poets, and they all needed a lot of space to swing their big broadswords, like their big Celtic broadswords, and do their warrior feats.
Yeah, those salmon leaps.
You cannot salmon leap in a close quarter fight. I think Cuchulainn would back us up on that.
He would.
Oh, and another problem, she couldn't use her war chariots. You remember, the Britons used war chariots back then. There's this iconic image of Boudicca riding up and down her army in a war chariot, which we're going to talk about. War chariots at this point, even in the Celtic world, were old tech, but the Britons were one of the few cultures still using them. But in this narrow space, the war chariots really had no room to maneuver. Boudicca's army, they really needed a wide open space where they could outmaneuver the Romans, overrun them with their sheer volume, use their war chariots and their warrior feats and their giant broadswords, and find a way to swamp the Romans on all sides. But the layout of the land really did not work in her favor here.
Yeah, so Boudicca led her army onto the field, not fully understanding her terrain.
Or maybe understanding it, but knowing that she had no other choice at this point.
Exactly. And I'm using this quote that Tacitus gives Boudicca. It's absolutely epic. It's this pre-battle speech. The version of it I'm using comes from Vanessa Collingridge's book, Boudicca. I'm not sure if she translated it or who the translator is, but I just want to give that shout out because it's a really clear translation to what is otherwise quite a confusing speech. So here we go. Quote, Boudicca and her chariot with her daughters in front of her rode up to tribe after tribe, arguing that it was perfectly normal for Britons to fight under women leaders. Now this is Boudicca speaking. Quote, within a quote, but now it is not as a woman descended from illustrious ancestry, but as one of the people that I am avenging my lost freedom, my lashed body, the outraged honor of my daughters. Roman greed has developed to such an extent that not even our persons, not even our age or our virginity are left unpolluted. But heaven is on the side of just vengeance. One legion which dared to fight has been destroyed. The rest are cowering in their camps or anxiously seeking a means of escape. They will not stand even din and shout of so many thousands, let alone our attack and our weapons. If you balance the strength of our armies and the reasons for this war, then you must conquer or die. This is a woman's decision. As for men, they can live and become slaves.
What does that mean, that last line?
Well, I think what she's saying here is like, for women, really the only option here is conquer or die.
I can see how she's talking about, to the Romans, not even our bodies are sacrosanct. Like, they just use women's bodies like just another resource. You know, it's absolutely true that men can also be raped and also have no bodily autonomy in slavery. The situation may have been a lot worse for women just in terms of rape. That may be what she's saying.
We definitely can't say that for sure. I think one of the things to also remember about this here that's very important is in this society, and with Boudicca being a queen, really the only option for her is conquer or die. Under Roman rule, women did not have the same rights that they had in the Brittonic tribes. You don't see women being queens. You don't see women with an autonomy leading their people the way you see Boudicca or Cartimandua or other Iron Age British warrior queens.
Maybe by saying this is a woman's decision, she's also saying this is my decision. And if you disagree with it, you can live and become slaves.
Exactly. You can go run right over to Paulinus and say, "Hi, Paulinus, I don't want to fight anymore."
See how that goes for you.
Exactly. So this speech is, of course, apocryphal. It was something that Tacitus made up to tell a better story. You know, remember, these are all said aloud and read to people, and none of this is exactly what she would have said. But it's still a really incredible speech and a fascinating one. And ironically, or maybe on purpose, it's much better than the very blunt and sort of boring speech that Paulinus has given, which I didn't even bother repeating because it is quite boring. Boudicca is filled with passion. She rides her war chariot up and down the lines of her warriors, like the Morrigan, like Andraste, a goddess made flesh and blood, stalking the battleground with her hand-picked fighters, her gorgeous ginger hair just waving in the breeze. I mean, allegedly. You can just imagine how her people must have felt listening to their queen give them a rousing speech about how there were no options except victory or death. And in my mind, it's very similar to that moment that we had last season, where Spartacus slaughtered his prized horse before battle to show his soldiers that they were all equal, and the only horse he'd need he could claim from the Romans' dead cavalry soldiers. And of course, if he fell, he wasn't going to need a horse anyway. But if he died, he would be as a member of his own infantry. He was not above them. They were all equal.
Spartacus trained that horse by hand. I don't think he would have just killed his horse. I'm sorry.
Well, and as we've talked about many times, Thracians were horse lords. That's not how they would have treated a horse.
We hope so. I mean, we're projecting a lot.
We're projecting a lot, and that's fine. I'm allowed to have feels about Spartacus.
I have feels about Spartacus, and my feels about Spartacus are that he was not down for animal cruelty.
Yeah, I have feels about Boudicca, and it's okay. It doesn't mean I'm right. It's very complicated.
We have complicated feelings. So the difference is that Boudicca rode into battle on a chariot as a queen. She was visible. She wanted Paulinus to be able to see her. She wanted the Romans to know that a woman was leading such a massive force into battle because it was a giant fuck you. She was leading a force that was loud enough to make the earth shake when they charged, whose songs and battle cries would haunt the battleground forever. If only things had gone a different way. If only Boudicca and her advisors had been more experienced in dealing with their cunning Roman foes. There are a million if-onlys we could lay out for you, but sadly, Boudicca and her rebellion were moments away from destruction. Tacitus tells us that the battle went down like this. Quote, "With such alacrity had Paulinus' veteran troops, with a long experience of battle, prepared themselves in the moment to hurl the pilum, that Paulinus, without a doubt of the issue, gave the signal to engage. At first, the legionaries stood motionless, keeping to the defile as a natural protection. Then, when the closer advance of the enemy had enabled them to exhaust their missiles with certitude of aim, they dashed forward in a wedge-like formation. The auxiliaries charged in the same style, and the cavalry, with lances extended, broke a way through any parties of resolute men whom they encountered. The remainder took to flight, although escape was difficult as the cordon of wagons had blocked the outlets. The troops gave no quarter even to the women. The baggage animals themselves had been speared and added to the pile of bodies. The glory won in the course of the day was remarkable and equal to that of our older victories. For, by some accounts, little less than 80,000 Britons fell, at a cost of some 400 Romans killed and not a much greater number of wounded.
So let's break this down. Boudicca's army charged into battle. It must have been a riotous cacophony of horns and songs and battle cries and just the hills shaking all around them. The Britons would have been fighting in their tribal gear, and some possibly went into battle naked with their torques.
Possibly because they lost their cloaks and their brooches because it's easy to lose a brooch.
You just love that fact, I told you.
They weren't just boldly going into battle naked with their torque. No, they had suffered a disastrous wardrobe malfunction and it was very embarrassing for everyone, but here they are.
So they would have been flying free without uniform weapons or armor, and with a strategy that was much less defined than their Roman oppressors. Their strategy appears to be full steam ahead, maybe letting it all fly free. The Romans, on the other hand, knew they had to hold the line, draw out as much of Boudicca's forces as possible, and then use Boudicca's baggage train and the woods at the back of the army to effectively trap them in place. When the battle turned, when Boudicca and her army knew that they had been caught in a trap, you can only imagine the horror and shock. Here's what came next. Paulinus's men held the line and pressed forward. Boudicca's army fled in the opposite direction, but they were driven up against their own baggage train, which had been bringing up the rear, sheltering their non-combatant women and children. The Romans ground Boudicca's army up against the wagons of the baggage train, which quickly became a wall of overturned wagons and slaughtered bodies of pack animals and non-combatants.
Yeah, because the Romans were making a point of killing the pack animals and the non-combatants to make that wall. So Paulinus slaughtered all the men, women, and children on the field and the pack animals and basically everything moving. Random squirrels, bunnies.
Red squirrels, at this point in time, they would have been native British red squirrels, not the gray squirrels that you have, which are an invasive species, which came from, I believe, the Americas. But you would have had red squirrels. Sheepsies.
Different kinds of rabbits and hares and bunnies. Anything caught alive on this battlefield got speared by the Romans. They were not holding back.
But not the scribbles. They just ran pretty quickly.
The scribbles?
Squirrels. My husband and I call them scribbles.
The scribbles. You know what?
Is it weird that Glenn and I call squirrels scribbles?
It's just so weird.
I just think it's funny.
It's weird, John. It's weird.
You're so uncomfortable. It's like me when we talk about nakedness. I love it.
Can we move on?
You can do whatever you want, babe.
Tacitus tells us that 80,000 Britons died compared to only 400 Roman casualties. These numbers on both sides are clearly exaggerated.
You can't believe those numbers. Number one, a round number is always a lie. And number two, that ratio just doesn't work out.
It's likely that Boudicca's army did experience huge losses, but if she had an army of 230,000, where were the rest of her people? 80,000 was only a fraction of her forces, right?
Yeah, because according to Dio, as we said at the beginning of this episode, it was 230,000. Where are the rest?
230,000 minus 80,000 is 150,000?
170? I'm not sure.
We're bad at math over here.
Over 100,000 have just disappeared into the woods.
After the victory at Watling Street, Paulinus went on a bloody bender all across Britain. He replenished his troops with auxiliaries from Germania and kept them in the field, living out of tents throughout the winter instead of retiring to a more comfortable winter camp. It would have been cold and muddy and fucking miserable.
As someone who's just lived through a cold, muddy, and fucking miserable British winter in the south of England, I can attest to this, and I didn't live outdoors.
Yeah, and there were two reasons why Paulinus needed to torture his troops by making them live in tents in the wintertime in Britain. To send a message that Romans were actually, in fact, hardy enough to survive the harsh winters, because Boudicca had given this whole speech in our last episode about how the Romans were completely undone by the harsh winters. It really touched a nerve.
Again, this is according to the ancient writers.
Yeah, and to foster a certain amount of hatred amongst the troops. Paulinus wanted his army to blame the British tribes for their conditions and resent them for having to live in tents. That's what he wanted. He wanted them to be good and mad. The troops were now ready for the next phase of Paulinus' plan.
Just Operation Do More Genocide to the native people of a country by Romans.
So, according to Vanessa Collingridge, quote, Paulinus' soldiers would have had plenty of time to exercise their hatred as the troops swept through the British countryside seeking retribution for the uprising, setting fire to farmsteads and food stores, which is how they kept warm because it was winter and they had to live in tents, and putting the local tribespeople to the sword. It was not enough of a defense merely not to have taken part to the Romans that still made you complicit in the revolt, which is kind of like Boudicca's attitude as well.
Look, Boudicca was onto something. If you had sided with her and joined with her, you would have known that the Romans couldn't do this to you ever again. But you didn't listen.
You made your beds, kids. Now you have to lie in them. That is what Boudicca's saying from beyond the grave right now. Only the client kingdoms, such as those of Cagadumnus and Cartamantua, escaped the widespread retribution, for they had been amongst the few who had remained steadfast in their loyalty.
Yeah, and Vanessa Collingridge goes on to explain that, quote, for the losers, the devastation on the battlefield was nothing compared to that which was now wrought across the remainder of the province, and nowhere more so than in the lands of the Iceni and the Trinovantes. All vestiges of our old friend Pastosaurus's client kingdom were systematically stripped away. His lands and those of Boudicca were now under direct and unforgiving military control. Forts were built all over East Anglia in the aftermath of the uprising, as much to serve as commanding iconography of the new foreign rule as to impose its will. The Iceni were either killed, forced out of their homes, or sold into slavery in a genocidal revenge that devastated an entire people. So at this point, Paulinus was about as popular with the native Britons as a turd sandwich. And when a new procurator called Julius Classicanus.
It's classic anus. It's another anus name.
And we're so mature.
It has not escaped my notice that most of the Roman men involved in Boudicca's stories had names that involved the word anus.
It's true. Anyway, when this new procurator took over, he sparked a feud with Paulinus. Classicanus was a Celt with a Roman name, which meant he probably had Roman citizenship. And he had no love for Paulinus. I mean, can't possibly think why that might be.
I don't think even Paulinus' mom had any love for Paulinus at this point.
Anyway, Classicanus
What's that name, Jen? What's that name?
Classicanus.
Classicanus.
Classicanus is what I'm calling him. Classicanus talked to the local Britons. He told them, look, just wait this guy out. He's going to be withdrawn soon, and a new governor will come in, and he can't possibly be this bad. All you got to do, just wait this guy out.
I mean, he could be worse. Have you heard of Paulus the Chain?
Yeah, Paulus the Chain wasn't born for a while yet. Don't scare the kids.
That's true, but I'm just saying, theoretically, it could be worse.
I mean, yeah, they don't know that. And also, I'm kind of guessing that, Classicanus is angling to be governor himself.
Maybe so. So what happened here was kind of dueling dispatches. Classicanus, as the kids like to say, would write to Rome telling them how awful Paulinus was doing. And at the same time, Paulinus was writing back saying the opposite. Eventually, the emperor, Nero, had enough and realized that Paulinus' presence in the colony was very destabilizing and was causing more problems than solutions. I just need you to bring me solutions, Paulinus, not problems. That's what Nero said. It's said that Nero was so discouraged with how the Boudicca rebellion had turned out that he almost pulled out his troops and abandoned the province of Britain entirely. Instead, Nero recalled Paulinus to Rome and another governor took over. According to Tacitus, quote, Paulinus was ordered, under pretense that the war was still in being, to transfer his army to Petronius Turpilianus. So many anuses in this story.
But only one classic one.
Petronius Turpilianus, who by now had laid down his consulate. The newcomer abstained from provoking the enemy, was not challenged himself, and conferred on the spiritless in action the honorable name of peace. I mean, I guess you could call peace spiritless in action, if you want to be a jerk about it.
So basically, Paulinus' punitive measures were too extreme, even for neckbeard Nero.
We don't know exactly what those punitive measures were. We do not have the details, but they were too extreme for Nero.
We can guess. It involves a lot of destabilization, crucifixion, and taking out a lot of his aggression on the native peoples. Anyway, Nero recalled Paulinus and replaced him with Turpilianus. And Turpilianus was a guy more willing to keep the peace. But Paulinus was not disgraced. He got to be consul in 66 AD, about 6 years later. And in 69 AD, Nero died, and Rome descended into a year of instability and chaos, later called the Year of the Four Emperors. During that time, Galba took over from Nero, only to be immediately assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, assisted by a Roman noble named Otho, who became emperor in turn. Paulinus emerged as one of Otho's top generals and military advisors. But like so many people in the Year of the Four Emperors, Paulinus backed the wrong horse. He was eventually captured in battle with Vitellius, Otho's successor. Paulinus tried to convince Vitellius he'd been on his side all along. Seriously, dude. Giving Otho bad advice so Otho would lose all his battles. Like, I'm not a bad general. I'm just like on your side, but behind enemy lines.
Yeah, and actually Otho did ignore Paulinus' advice a lot, so I don't know. He's just like, look at how bad this guy does at battles. Clearly I must be fucking him up on purpose.
Exactly. So we're not sure if Vitellius believed what Paulinus was trying to sell him, or what happened to him after that. Nobody knows how he died.
So that is what happened to Paulinus. But what happened to Boudicca after the Battle of Watling Street? Tacitus and Dio both tell us that once she realized the battle was lost, she drank poison, in a move very similar to Cleopatra's death by asp. That poetic death was kind of a trope in Roman history. It serves to tell Roman readers that foreign queens will never win against the might of Rome, that in the end, they always take their own lives. It's possible that Boudicca did take her own life after the battle was lost. She would have known that if the Romans had captured her, she would have wished for death on the battlefield. Walking in a triumph, or being crucified, would have been infinitely worse than death in battle for the proud warrior queen. Her death being made a form of amusement and aggrandizement for her oppressor would have been a great insult to her honor. Taking her own life would have seemed like a more dignified alternative. That's our thought, at least.
However, it's also likely that Boudicca died on the battlefield. If she died early in the battle, perhaps her lack of leadership is why her people walked straight into Paulinus' trap. We'll never know. But I wanted to stop for a minute here in the episode before we talk about where Boudicca might be buried in the end of Boudicca, and talk a little bit about the big Boudicca versus the little Boudicca. So one of the really interesting things that I noticed when I was researching Boudicca is a lot of people came out quite quickly to tell me, like, particularly on social media, oh, Boudicca is so passionate, but no strategy. You know, if only Boudicca had more strategy. And we tend to see people like Vercingetorix or Spartacus, who are written about by the ancient sources, as having a lot of strategy and having a lot of thought behind what they're doing. And we look at their motives for how their rebellions work. But we don't see that with Boudicca. What we see with Boudicca is the reason for why she revolts. And the reason she revolts has a lot to do with personal outrage and honor against her and her tribe. And when Jenny and I were working on this series, I felt really strongly that it was so important that in addition to talking about the outrage and the dishonor done to Boudicca and her community and her daughters, we also tried to look a little bit at the strategy. So like we talked about in the Spartacus series, the big Spartacus, which is, you know, the overarching, like, free all the slaves and the symbol of a revolution, versus the small Spartacus, the guy who has a reason to want to be out of slavery for him and potentially his wife, if she was ever with him, we don't know. The man versus the symbol of the man. And I wanted to take a moment right now to talk about Boudicca, the woman, the mother, the warrior queen versus the symbol of Boudicca.
Like, I'm always going to be a fan of the small Spartacus versus the large Spartacus. I'm always going to be a fan of the person versus the symbol. That's just how I'm wired. That's the story I find interesting. But I feel like Boudicca isn't usually afforded, at least I haven't seen her, afforded the chance to be big Boudicca. She's always small Boudicca. She's always, like, reacting to horrible things that the Romans did to her and her family personally. It's never about the bigger picture. And is that gendered?
It's absolutely gendered, and it's gendered in the fact that the people who were writing about her weren't interested in her as a symbol of, like, an uprising about a larger people. They wanted to make it about one woman against the dishonor for her and her tribe and her daughters. because to make it about like all of her people would be to give her this sort of status and mythicism that why would you afford to a woman in that way?
Yeah, and they do afford it to men in that way, even men that were enemies of Rome. Like Vercingetorix gets that treatment, Spartacus gets that treatment, Alaric gets that treatment. And the other thing is the strategy aspect of it. The part of it where people just assumed that Boudicca was all passion and no strategy. Jen and I had a text argument about this, and our arguments over text are just so fun.
They're fun for us. I'm not sure they're fun for anyone else.
Jen was like, I have to call you. I have to talk this out. This is just not coming through over text, which means she's like really worked up.
Means I'm getting ready to burn everything down Boudicca style.
I forget what we were talking about. Like, we were talking about how to talk about Boudicca in one paragraph or one part of the episode that Jen had written and that I was editing, and she didn't like my edits. You didn't like me presenting her as just passionate and angry and scorching her anger into the earth because she's always presented as all passion and no strategy.
And Jenny's point, which is also equally important, is she was flogged. Her daughters were raped. Like, she has a righteous reason to be passionate and to scourge this anger into the earth and to deny that fact as a woman, as a survivor, as someone who has gone through that, is to cut out that experience and to invalidate it, which is not something I wanted to do in any way, shape, or form. What I wanted to do and what I was trying to get out of the edit was that she's both. And it's so important that she gets to be both big Boudicca and small Boudicca, because a lot of times we only see her as one.
I agree. And I think that, one of the hills that I wanted to die on was like, why don't women get to be angry and also strategic? Like, why does our anger erase our strategy? It shouldn't, and that was the hill that we wound up dying on here.
Yeah, we had to stop text fighting because we both were on the same hill and we're like, so we're both dying on the same hill, right? Okay, great.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is important to point out, and we've pointed it out elsewhere in this episode, is that things that Boudicca did, like burning down the towns the way that she did, were also things that Vercingetorix did. And when he did it, it's called strategy. And when she does it, it's called passion.
Part of, as we posited in our cold open, because there is no evidence one way or another, was Boudicca lighting everything on fire? Was she trying to send a message to the other tribes that there is one way forward and it is everyone aligned with Rome has to go and only all together can we rise and get rid of the oppressors? We'll never know. There's so much of her story that's not recorded because the people recording that story didn't have a dog in that fight and they weren't interested in it. So we can only kind of think about it and make our own assumptions, which are, ultimately erroneous because we don't know one way or another for sure. We're just writing the fan fiction here. But I'd like to think that Boudicca had strategy, and her strategy was literally join us or die.
And we bring our own lens and our own prejudices to the story like anyone else would.
Her feelings were, there is no peace with the Romans because if you side with them, they will still screw you over. And not only will they screw you over, they will do it in the most awful, public, humiliating, horrible way for you, for your loved ones, for your family. So when you're faced with that injustice, the only thing you can do is rid it from your land like a toxic poison. So, her strategy was burn it all to the ground, burn it out. And we saw it, as Jenny said, with Vercingetorix. We've seen it with many other people, and in those places it's called strategy. When Boudicca does it, it's just called flailing. So I want to talk now about where we think Boudicca is buried. Here's the thing. We don't know. Some legends say that she's buried beneath Stonehenge.
It's extremely unlikely.
So unlikely, but it's one of those mythic things that people are like, Boudicca's buried under Stonehenge. It's like, no, she's not, but okay.
They would have found her. I mean, Stonehenge is really picked over.
But also, why would she, it's not even a place I think she was. But anyway, other theories suggest that she is buried at Boudicca's mound at Hampstead Heath in London, which is obviously named for her. Although excavations of this mound have not turned up her body, only domestic rubbish from that time period.
Other theories suggest that she was buried at Peckham Rye in Southwark on the south bank of the Thames in London, or under the platforms of King's Cross Station, right over where the one that goes to Hogwarts is. I don't know. But there's no evidence of these theories. This is all just fan fiction. It's possible that we'll never know where Boudicca was laid to rest because she fell on the battlefield and was buried in a mass grave, or burned on a pyre, or torn apart in the violence of battle. And since we don't actually know the location of the final battle of Watling Street, we might just have to live in speculation and mystery until one day the present catches up to the past and archaeologists unearth an ancient secret.
Wherever Boudicca calls her final resting place, we hope that she can hear us almost 2,000 years in the future, singing the songs of her epic battle, letting her live again, riding into righteous war to defend her homeland, her rule, and her people. That's it for this week and for our Boudicca arc. We really hope you've enjoyed it. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Ancient History Fangirl and on Twitter at Ancient History Fan.
We have a Patreon. It's at patreon.com/Ancient History Fangirl, where you can support the podcast and get extra episodes. And we have quite a few extra episodes about the world of Roman Britain and Boudicca's world, and kind of deepening and enriching your understanding of this time period from a lot of different angles. And it's really, really great.
And if you're just here for the drunken mythology, we've got quite a few episodes with Liv from Myths Baby, where we retell some drunken myths, including that time Jenny and I decided to tell her the entire story of the Hound of Ulster.
Sign up at the $10 level and you really get our id.
I'm not gonna lie, we talked about maybe finding Robin Hood, the fox in the Disney cartoon, kind of fetch.
We go in depth. And our sexual attraction to the cartoon fox, it's awesome.
And you'll have to join our Patreon to find out more. Right now, Jenny, we have some patrons to thank.
Blanket statement, we apologize to anyone whose name we mispronounce. It's probably going to happen. We can't even pronounce Prostegosaurus.
Thank you so much to Sean Williams,
Sarah Rippey,
Juliet Talavera,
Kirby Carlson,
Amelie Reardon,
Ashley King,
Elizabeth Moreno,
William Petty,
Helena Waterus,
Lauren Voller,
Jessica Reeves. Our patrons are the only reason we can keep doing this podcast. It is how Jenny and I are able to keep things afloat. We do one day want to be professional podcasters, and that's only going to happen through ad revenue, through listenerships and review, and new patrons. So if you're able, anything you can give, we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your support.
Thank you, and we'll see you guys again in 2 weeks.